Tonight, let your thoughts drift south and very far back to a long green valley lying in the middle of a great desert, and to the river that made it. It is late in the summer of a year so old that the number has almost stopped meaning anything, and the river is rising. It has been rising for weeks. It came first as a change in the color of the water, a slow greening, then a slow browning. And then the smell of wet earth arriving from somewhere upstream that nobody in this village has ever seen. Now the water has spread out of its banks and lies across the flat black fields in a wide, shallow sheet, and in the last of the evening light, that sheet is the color of poured copper, and it is so still that the palms along the embankment are standing in it twice. Once upward and once downward, and the second palm is trembling only slightly. A boy is sitting on the mud brick roof of his family's house with his knees drawn up, watching the water come. He is not afraid of it. Nobody here is afraid of it. The water is the reason there is a house to sit on. Somewhere off to the left a heron lifts out of the flood with that slow, untroubled effort herons have. As though flying were a chore it had decided to do properly, and the boy watches it until it becomes a mark and then nothing at all. Behind him, inland, the desert begins almost at once, a hard, bright line of sand and stone that the flood will never reach, and beyond that line there's nothing for a very long way. The whole of his world is this ribbon of black, wet soil between two deserts. A country shaped like a green thread laid down across a yellow table. He does not know the name of his country. He does not know that in a few centuries people will paint this same flood on walls in these same colors, or that in a few thousand years people in cities he could not imagine will still be arguing gently about how his descendants moved certain very large stones. He knows only that the water has come again, on time, the way it comes, and that when it goes down there will be a fresh layer of soft black mud lying over everything, and that seed pressed into that mud will do what seed does. That is the whole secret. That is the engine underneath 3,000 years of kings and temples and gold and paperwork, a river that floods on a schedule. Tonight, we are going to follow that river from the very beginning to the very end. From the hunters who walked into the valley when the grasslands outside began to die, to the first king who wore 2 crowns at once, to the men who cut a mountain into a staircase for the dead, to the queen who sent ships down the Red Sea for incense trees, to the boy king in the golden mask, to the treaty carved in 2 languages, to the last of the pharaohs, and then to the long quiet afterward, when the temples fell silent and the writing became unreadable for 1,400 years, until a young Frenchman with a headache worked out what the little pictures had been saying all along. It is a very long story. That is rather the point. Settle now into whatever stillness you have been able to make for yourself. Let the room be as dark as it wants to be. Let the lamp grow dim, and let the small weight of the day slip down off your shoulders 1 quiet inch at a time, the way sand slips off a warm stone. There is nothing here that needs you to be alert. There will be no sudden noise and no surprise. If you fall asleep in the first 10 minutes, that is not a failure. That is the entire purpose. And the story will still be here, waiting patiently, the way this river has waited for everything else. If you enjoy what I make here, you might gently press the like button or subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and only if your hand is not already too heavy to bother. And if you feel like it before you go under, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other sleepless people find their way here, and there is a particular comfort in reading that somebody is listening to the same slow words at 4 in the morning on the other side of the world. Now, before there was Egypt, there was no Egypt. There was not even a valley worth living in. To find the beginning, we have to go back before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before writing, before the fields, to a time when the great desert we now call the Sahara was not a desert at all. Around 12,000 years ago, the rain belts of the world shifted north, and the enormous belt of sand that lies across the top of Africa turned green. Not lush, not a jungle, but green the way a good grassland is green, with seasonal lakes and marshes, with rivers that ran and stopped and ran again, with acacia and tamarisk in the hollows, with elephant and giraffe and antelope and hippopotamus and crocodile living in places where today there is nothing but stone and a wind that tastes faintly of iron. People lived out there. We know because they left their pictures on the rock. In the far southwest of modern Egypt, in a shallow overhang in the middle of what is now one of the driest places on the planet, there is a cave wall covered with small painted human figures with their arms out and their legs bent, and for a long time people looked at them and said that they seemed to be swimming. It is called the Cave of the Swimmers, and whether they are swimming or floating or dancing or doing something we have no word for, the point is the same. There was water there once, and there were people there once, and both of those things are gone. For thousands of years, those people lived well out in the open country, following the rain and the herds. They kept cattle very early, possibly earlier than anyone else on the continent. They set up standing stones in stone circles at a place called Nabta Playa, arranged in ways that seemed to track the sun at midsummer, which is a habit that goes on to have a considerable future in this story. They buried cattle in stone-lined chambers with what looks like real ceremony, which suggests that a cow was already more than a cow. They were not primitive. They were simply living in a version of North Africa that no longer exists. And then, slowly, over centuries, the rain belts moved back to the south. The lakes shrank, and the grass thinned, and the game drifted away, and the green Sahara dried into the Sahara we know. This did not happen in a night. It happened over generations, so that a woman might notice that a certain pool her grandmother spoke of was now only wet after a storm, and her own granddaughter might not believe there had ever been a pool there at all. And as the outside dried, the people did what people do. They walked toward the water that was left. They walked east toward a river that did not depend on local rain at all, because it was fed from 1,000 miles away, from the monsoon falling on the highlands of Ethiopia and from the Great Lakes of equatorial Africa, and so it kept coming even when the sky above the valley gave nothing whatsoever for years at a stretch. The Nile. It is worth stopping on that river for a moment, because everything after this is downstream of it in every sense. It is one of the longest rivers on earth, and it runs the wrong way, from the south to the north, which is why in the Egyptian language the word for going south and the word for going upstream are tangled together, and why to this day Upper Egypt is in the south and Lower Egypt is in the north, which confuses absolutely everybody the first time they meet it. In the highlands of Ethiopia, the summer monsoon drops an enormous quantity of water onto steep volcanic country, and that water tears the topsoil off the mountains and carries it down through the Blue Nile, and the Blue Nile joins the White Nile. And the whole brown loaded flood pushes north through the deserts of Sudan, over a series of rocky cataracts, and out into a narrow trench between two cliffs of limestone and sandstone. And every year, in the late summer, it swells and spills sideways into that trench, lays down a thin sheet of fertile volcanic mud, and then withdraws. Every year, on a schedule so reliable that it could be built into a calendar, and that calendar is one of the oldest still traceable in the world. Think for a moment about what that does to a people. In most of the ancient world, farming was a running argument with the weather. You watched the sky and you prayed and you guessed, and one bad season could empty a village. In the Nile Valley, the important water did not come from the sky at all. It came around the corner from the south, from a place nobody in Egypt had ever been. And it came in the same month every year, and it left behind soil so rich that it renewed itself annually without anyone needing to understand why. All you had to do was be organized. All you had to do was measure the flood, store the surplus, share the water, and settle the arguments about whose field ended, whereafter the mud had quietly erased every boundary marker in the country, which is, if you look at it in a certain light, the whole of Egyptian civilization in a single sentence. A state is a machine for remembering where the boundaries were. So they came into the valley. Slowly, in small groups, over 1,000 years and more, families of herders and hunters and fishers came in off the drying grassland and settled along the banks and in the marshes, and the valley began to fill with villages. And here the story starts to leave the rock paintings behind and go down into the ground, because those villages buried their dead. And the dead were buried with things, and things survive. And because the flood was the engine, the flood became the clock. The Egyptian year had 3 seasons and not 4, and none of them was winter, because winter as a concept does not apply to a place where the temperature is a mild inconvenience and the water is everything. The first season was Akat, the inundation, when the fields were under water and the villages sat on their small islands of higher ground, and the boats went where the donkeys usually went. The second was Pharaoh, the emergence, when the water withdrew and the black land came up out of it, and everything was sown at once, in a rush, pressing seed into mud so soft that in some places you could drive animals across a field to tread it in and be finished. The third was Shamu, the drought, the harvest, and the long, hot, dry stretch before it all began again. 12 months of 30 days each, 3 10-day weeks to a month, which is 360, and then 5 extra days added on at the end of the year. Outside the calendar, when the great gods were said to have been born, and when nothing much was expected of anybody. It is a solar calendar of 365 days, and it is the direct ancestor of the one on your wall, having passed to Rome and been given a leap day by Julius Caesar on the advice of an astronomer from Alexandria. The Egyptians themselves never adopted the leap day, despite knowing perfectly well that their year was a quarter of a day short, which meant their calendar slipped steadily against the seasons, going all the way around and coming back into alignment once every 1,460 years. They knew. They wrote it down. They simply preferred not to interfere with a system that worked well enough and was old, which is, depending on your temperament, either maddening or admirable. The moment they actually watched for was not in the calendar at all, but in the sky. The brightest star in the heavens, which we call Sirius and they called Sopdet, spends about 70 days each year invisible, lost in the glare of the sun. And then, at a particular time in midsummer, it reappears for the first time low in the east just before dawn, a hard white point in the last of the darkness, and in ancient Egypt that reappearance fell within a few days of the first rise of the flood, a star that vanishes for 70 days and then comes back, precisely when the water does. If you were building a religion around death and return and the necessity of getting the timing right, you could hardly ask for a better sign, and the 70 days of embalming are very probably the 70 days that Star spends in the underworld. Along the river they built nilometers to measure the water, stone staircases and shafts going down to the water table, cut with a scale on the wall, so that priests and officials could read off the height of the rise and send word downstream. Those readings were the most important numbers in the country, because the tax on the coming harvest was set from them, which means the Egyptian Revenue Service was operating a predictive model based on a river gauge 4,500 years ago. The very earliest royal annals, carved on a slab of black stone, record the flood height year by year alongside the king's deeds, and they are recorded with the same weight, because they were of the same importance. And the readings mattered in both directions. A low flood meant thin fields and hunger, but a high flood was no gift either. Too much water breaks the dikes, drowns the seed grain, sweeps away the mud brick, silts up the canals, and takes the boundary stones with it. What Egypt wanted was not a big flood. It was the correct flood, arriving on time and stopping at the right line on the wall, which is ma'at again, expressed in cubits of water. The right amount, in the right place, at the right time, is the whole of the Egyptian idea of goodness, and they got it from watching a river. The oldest of these village cultures that we can really put a name to lived in the southern part of the valley, near a bend in the river at a place called El Badari, and they lived there something like 6,500 years ago. They grew emmer wheat and barley, they kept goats and sheep and cattle, they fished the river with nets and harpoons, and they made pottery that is, quite honestly, better than the pottery of many far later and far grander societies. Their finest bowls are burnished a deep, even red with a black rim, produced by firing the vessel upside down in the ashes so that the mouth was starved of air and the surface has a sheen on it like the inside of a chestnut. They also made small combs and spoons and figurines out of ivory and bone, and they lined their eyes with green malachite ground on flat slate palettes, which was probably partly for beauty and partly because a dark line under the eye genuinely cuts the glare off a river that shines all day. And they buried their dead lying on their left side, knees drawn up like sleepers, heads to the south, facing the west. Facing the west. That detail is small, and it is worth holding, because the west is where the sun goes down. And for the next 3,500 years, the west bank of the Nile is where the Egyptians will put their dead, in cemetery after cemetery after cemetery, until the phrase going west becomes their gentlest way of saying that somebody has died. The idea is already there, in the ground, before there is a single line of writing to explain it. After the Badarians came the culture we call Nakata, named after another site further south. And with Nakata, the pace picks up sharply. Over roughly 1,000 years, from about 4,400 to about 3,100 years before the Common Era, these river villages turn into towns, and the towns turn into small competing kingdoms. And the small competing kingdoms turn into one country. You can watch it happen in the graves. The early Nakata burials are modest and fairly equal. Everyone gets a pot, a pallet, a few beads. Then, gradually, some graves get bigger. Some get lined with mud brick, then roofed, then divided into rooms, while the graves next to them stay simple pits. Some contain imported goods, lapis lazuli that can only have come from the mountains of Afghanistan, cedar from the coast of Lebanon, obsidian from Ethiopia, copper from Sinai, gold from the eastern desert. Some contain mace heads and flint knives so finely worked with such absurdly delicate parallel flaking that they were clearly never meant to cut anything except perhaps someone's opinion of the owner. Craft becomes display. Display becomes rank. And rank, given a few centuries and a good harvest, becomes a state. 3 towns in particular grew fat on this. In the far south, Hierakonpolis, which the Egyptians called Nekhen, the city of the falcon, where archaeologists have found the earliest known brewery in Egypt, capable of turning out hundreds of gallons of thick, nourishing beer, and the earliest painted tomb, and a menagerie of exotic animals that somebody was keeping and burying with real ceremony, including elephant and baboon and hippopotamus. A little to the north, Nakata itself, the town of the god Set, and further north again, Abydos, which will become the holiest ground in the country. These places traded with each other and, one assumes, occasionally raided each other, and a pattern of the pottery suggests that over time the southern style spread steadily northward until the whole valley, from the first cataract down to the delta, was making and using the same kinds of things. Whether that spread happened by conquest, or by fashion, or by marriage, or by all 3 at once is one of those questions that will be debated politely forever. What is not debated is that at the end of it there was one kingdom where there had been many. Egyptians themselves remembered it as the joining of the 2 lands. Upper Egypt, the long, narrow valley in the south, whose emblem was the tall white crown and whose plant was the sedge, and Lower Egypt, the wide green fan of the delta in the north, whose emblem was the low red crown with its curling wire, and whose plant was the papyrus. Every king for the next 3,000 years will be described as the Lord of the 2 lands, wearing both crowns nested together into the double crown, and every temple wall will show the sedge and the papyrus tied together in a knot around a windpipe, an image whose meaning is roughly this country is bound into one, and it breathes as one thing. It is a remarkably durable piece of political branding. It outlasts the political situation it describes by an almost comical margin, and it is still being carved on temple walls by Greek kings and Roman emperors who had never seen either crown in their lives. The person credited with tying that knot is a king called Narmer, or possibly Menes, and the reason for the possibly is that ancient king lists and later Greek historians and the objects in the ground do not entirely agree. And it may be that the 2 names belong to the same man, or to a father and a son, or to a real person and a legendary one. What we have is a slab of dark green mudstone about 2 feet high, shield-shaped, carved on both sides, found at Hierakonpolis, and now one of the most stared-at objects in the Egyptian Museum. On one side, a king, wearing the tall white crown of the south, raises a mace over a kneeling enemy, while a falcon holds a rope through the nose of a personified marshland. On the other side, the same king, now wearing the red crown of the north, walks in procession toward rows of beheaded foes, and beneath him 2 attendants strain at ropes tied around the impossibly long entwined necks of 2 mythical beasts, the necks crossing to make a circle in the center of the palette. That circle is the part where you would grind eye paint. If this thing had ever been used for grinding eye paint, which it almost certainly was not, and above his head, on both sides, in the small square of a name box, are two signs, a catfish and a chisel. Nar, Mer, the first name we can read in Egyptian history. There is something quietly astonishing about that, not the violence, which is ordinary and which every early state on earth was busy carving somewhere. The astonishing thing is the grammar of the image, the proportions, the registers, the way the king is drawn larger than everyone else, the way he stands with his shoulders square to the viewer and his legs and face in profile, the way his name sits in a box above him, flanked by the emblems of the palace. All of that is already in place on this one object at the very beginning. And all of it is still in place, essentially unchanged, on temple walls carved 3,000 years later. Egyptian art is not primitive, and it is not a failed attempt at perspective. It is a code worked out early, agreed on completely, and then maintained with a patience that no other civilization has ever managed. They were not trying to show you what a man looks like from where you are standing. They were trying to show you what a man is, completely, with the shoulders that carry, the eye that sees, the legs that walk, all presented in their clearest possible aspect at once. It is closer to writing than to painting, which is fitting because writing was arriving at exactly this moment too. In the desert cemetery at Abydos, in a tomb known by the wonderfully bureaucratic label U-J, belonging to a ruler who lived a century or so before Narmer, excavators found several hundred small bone and ivory labels, each about the size of a thumbnail, each pierced with a little hole so it could be tied to a jar or a bale of cloth. And on each label are one or two tiny carved signs. A tree, a bird, a mountain range, an elephant standing on hills. These are not pictures. They are being used phonetically to spell out places and quantities and the estates that the goods came from, and they are, on current evidence, among the oldest writing on the planet, roughly contemporary with the first tablets from Mesopotamia and quite possibly independent of them. The first thing writing ever did, in Egypt as in Iraq, was not poetry and not prayer. It was labeling the delivery. Somebody wanted to know which jar of oil came from which estate, and out of that small administrative itch came a script that would carry hymns and love songs and medical texts and legal contracts and complaints about neighbors for the next 3,500 years. From those seeds grew the writing system we call hieroglyphs, which is a Greek word meaning sacred carvings, because by the time the Greeks arrived, the script was mostly seen on temples. The Egyptians called it the words of the god. And here is the thing most people do not know about it, and which makes the whole thing much less mystical and much more clever. Hieroglyphs are not picture writing in the sense of one drawing equaling one idea. They are a mixed system. Most of the signs stand for sounds, consonants, one or two or three at a time. Some stand for whole words, and some stand for nothing at all out loud, but sit silently at the end of a word telling you what category it belongs to, so that a word ending in a little pair of walking legs is something to do with motion, and a word ending in a seated man with his hand to his mouth is something to do with speaking or eating or thinking. Vowels were not written, which is why we cannot be certain how any of it actually sounded, and why the names we use are conventions with vowels stuffed in for convenience. Alongside the beautiful carved version there was always a fast cursive version, written with a reed brush on papyrus called hieratic for the daily work of running a country. And no scribe in his right mind carved a tax return in stone. Papyrus itself is worth a moment. It is a tall marsh reed with a triangular stem, and if you slice the pith into thin strips, lay one layer across another, press the whole thing under weight, and let the plant's own sap glue it together, you get a smooth, pale, flexible sheet that takes ink beautifully and in the dry Egyptian climate. Lasts for thousands of years. It was Egypt's great export, and it is the ancestor of the word paper, and an enormous share of everything we know about the ancient world survives, because somebody in Egypt wrote it on a reed and somebody else threw it into a dry rubbish heap. With Narmer and his immediate successors, we enter what historians called the early dynastic period. The first and second dynasties, roughly 3,100 to 2,700 years before the Common Era. The word dynasty here is inherited from a priest named Manetho, who lived under the Greek kings of Egypt almost 3,000 years after Narmer, and who wrote a history of his country in Greek, dividing its kings into 30 ruling houses. Manetho's own book is lost. We have him only in quotations inside quotations copied by later writers who were not always careful, and yet his 30 dynasties are still the skeleton every modern account hangs on, which is a strange kind of immortality for a man whose actual sentences have all dissolved. The first kings ruled from a new city planted at the hinge of the country, where the narrow valley opens out into the wide delta at the exact point where north and south have to be governed together. Its walls were plastered white, and so it was called the White Walls, and later it took the name of a nearby pyramid town and became Memphis, and it stayed the administrative heart of Egypt for the better part of 3,000 years. Almost nothing of it is left. It lies under palm groves and modern villages and a great deal of Nile mud, and where a city of 500,000 people once ran the oldest state on earth there is now a quiet field, a museum shed with a fallen colossus lying on its back inside it, and a very persistent population of stray cats, which the cats presumably regard as an entirely satisfactory outcome. The kings themselves, though, were buried far to the south, back at Abydos, in the desert behind the town, in great rectangular pits lined with mud brick and roofed with timber, surrounded by rows of smaller graves belonging to servants and officials, and, in some cases, to dwarfs and to dogs. Those subsidiary graves stop after the first dynasty, which is generally taken to mean that the practice of sending a household into the next world along with its king was quietly abandoned as a bad idea, and replaced with something a great deal more sensible and a great deal more Egyptian, little models and painted images of servants, which would do the same work in the afterlife without the awkward business of the servants having to be unavailable in this one. Egypt would keep making those little figures in wood and faience and stone for the next 2,500 years, and by the new kingdom a wealthy person might be buried with 365 of them, one for every day of the year, plus overseers to keep them in line, because even in eternity somebody has to be in charge of the rota. Out on the edge of the Abydos desert those first kings also built enormous empty enclosures of mud brick, walls 3 stories high and hundreds of feet long, standing on the open sand with nothing inside them. One of them, built for a king called Khsekhemre at the very end of the second dynasty, is still standing, and it is one of the oldest freestanding brick buildings on earth. It has been baking there for 4,700 years. Nobody is completely sure what happened inside those walls, but the shape of them, a great rectangle with a paneled facade, is the shape that appears again and again for the next 3 millennia, around pyramids, around temples, around the little painted false doors carved on the sides of coffins. It is the shape of a palace, and it is the shape of the horizon a dead king was supposed to step through. By the end of the Second Dynasty, something has consolidated. The country has a capital, a script, a calendar, a national art style, a system of taxation based on a census of cattle taken every 2 years, and a set of ideas about the world that will hold, with adjustments, until the temples close. It is worth laying those ideas out gently now, because everything that follows sits inside them. At the center is a word usually written as ma'at, which does not translate. It means truth, and it also means justice, and it also means order, and it also means the correct proportion of things, and it also means the way the world is supposed to run when nobody is interfering with it. Ma'at is shown as a slender woman with a single ostrich feather standing upright on her head, and that feather is what your heart gets weighed against at the end. The opposite of Ma'at is not sin exactly. It is disorder, chaos, the thing that is always pressing in from outside, from the desert, from the sea, from the years when the flood is too low or too high. The king's entire job, the reason he exists, is to hold Ma'at in place. Every temple scene for 3,000 years shows the king, and only the king, making the offering to the gods, because he is the hinge between the two worlds, and if the hinge fails, then the flood fails, and if the flood fails, then everything fails. It is a heavy job description, and it explains a great deal about why the Egyptians spent so much of their national wealth on making their kings enormous. The gods themselves are numerous, overlapping, cheerfully contradictory, and quite unbothered about it. Egypt never had one official theology. It had several, each grown up around a major city, each explaining the beginning of the world in its own way, and rather than pick a winner, the Egyptians simply kept all of them and let them coexist, occasionally welding two gods together into a hyphenated third when politics required it. At Heliopolis, the Sun City near modern Cairo, they said that in the beginning there was only Nun, a dark, limitless expanse of still water, and that out of it rose a single mound of mud, the way the first hilltops rise out of the receding flood every autumn, and on that mound the Creator brought himself into being, and then sneezed and spat the first pair of gods into existence, air and moisture, who produced earth and sky, who produced Osiris and Isis, and Set and Nephthys. At Memphis they said something considerably more abstract, that the god Ptah thought the world in his heart and spoke it with his tongue, and that everything which exists is the sound of that first thought being said out loud. At Hermopolis they counted 8 primordial beings, 4 frog-headed and 4 snake-headed, embodying darkness and hiddenness and endlessness and the water itself, who together produced an egg from which the sun hatched. All 3 stories were told in the same country at the same time by people who were not remotely troubled by the arithmetic. The sun is at the center of all of them, because in Egypt the sun is not a pleasant amenity, it is the daily proof that the world still works. Every morning it is born on the eastern horizon, every evening it dies on the western one, Every night it travels through the body of the sky goddess or through the 12 caverns of the underworld, and there, in the deepest hour, it meets the great serpent of chaos and has to be defended by the gods with knives, and then, having survived that, it is born again. Sunrise in Egypt is not a metaphor for hope. It is a bulletin confirming that the battle went the right way again. And underneath the sun sits the other great story, the one that made Egypt what it was, the story of Osiris. He was a king, in the old telling, a good one, who taught people farming and law. His brother Set, who is the god of the desert and the storm and the awkward energy that will not sit still, grew jealous, and by a trick shut Osiris inside a beautiful chest and cast him into the river, and later, when the body was recovered, tore it apart and scattered the pieces the length of the country. And his wife Isis, who is the cleverest being in Egyptian myth by an enormous margin, went and gathered every piece and put him back together with bandages and with magic, and revived him just long enough to conceive a son. That son, Horus, the falcon, grew up in the marshes hidden from his uncle, and eventually contested his father's throne in a lawsuit before the assembled gods that ran. According to one gloriously exasperated papyrus, for 80 years with adjournments. Horus won. He took the throne of the living, and Osiris, unable to return, became king of the dead instead, sitting in the west with green skin, wrapped like a mummy, the first being to die and the first to be made whole again. That is the story that gives Egypt its funerals, its embalming, its bandages, and its extraordinary confidence about death. Every living king is Horus. Every dead king is Osiris. And in time, as the idea spread downward through society, every dead person at all could be Osiris, could be reassembled, could be made whole, could go west and be welcomed. It is, when you strip the crocodile-headed monsters away, one of the most consoling stories anybody has ever told. Something was broken into pieces and scattered, and somebody who loved it went out and found every piece and put it back together, and it lived. And now the pyramids, because we have been circling them politely for long enough. The period we call the Old Kingdom runs from about 2,680 to about 2,180 years before the Common Era. The third dynasty through the sixth, and it is the age in which Egypt does something no society had done before, which is to build in cut stone at enormous scale, on purpose, permanently, and get it right almost immediately. The man who started it was a king of the third dynasty called Djoser, and the man who actually did it was his chief official, whose name was Imhotep. We know Imhotep existed because his name and titles are carved on the base of a statue of the king himself, which is an extraordinary honor for a commoner, and because Egypt never forgot him. 2,000 years after his death, he was being worshipped as a god of healing, and the Greeks matched him with their own god of medicine. And sick people were sleeping overnight in his shrines, hoping for a helpful dream. He is, as far as anyone can tell, the first architect in history whose name we know. Before Djoser, a king was buried under a low rectangular block of mud brick with sloping sides, a shape we call a mastaba, from the Arabic word for a bench, because that is what they look like sitting out on the sand. What Imhotep did at Saqqara, on the desert plateau above Memphis, was to build a mastaba out of stone instead of brick, which was already new, and then to enlarge it, and then to have what must count as one of the better ideas anybody has ever had in the middle of a construction project, which was to build another smaller one on top of it, and then another, and another. 6 in all, rising to about 200 feet, a staircase of stone standing up out of the flat desert, visible from the river, visible from the fields, visible from everywhere. The Step Pyramid. It is the oldest large stone building on Earth, and it is still standing. And if you go and look at it, you will notice that the blocks are small, roughly the size of the mud bricks the builders were used to handling, because nobody had yet worked out that stone lets you go bigger. They were writing in a new language with the vocabulary of the old one. Around it, Imhotep laid out an entire complex inside a white limestone wall a mile long, containing courtyards and shrines and a dummy palace and a set of buildings for a royal jubilee festival. And here is the loveliest detail in it. Most of those buildings are solid. They are not buildings at all. They are stone sculptures of buildings, with fake doors carved permanently open, false hinges and door leaves shown flat against the jamb, and stone fluted columns imitating bundles of reeds, and stone ceilings carved to look like palm logs. It is a whole architecture of representation, built for a person who no longer needed shelter, but did need the idea of shelter, and it works because in Egyptian thinking the image of a thing carries the reality of the thing. Which is also, incidentally, why enemies get their names hacked off walls, and why a scribe drawing a dangerous animal in a burial chamber will sometimes draw it neatly cut in half, just to be safe. If the picture is real, then the picture of a snake is a snake, and no one wants a snake loose in the tomb for eternity. After Djoser there is a slightly untidy stretch, with a couple of abandoned pyramid projects and some kings we barely know, and then the fourth dynasty begins and everything accelerates alarmingly. The first king of that dynasty was Sneferu, and Sneferu is the single most prolific builder in stone in Egyptian history, which is not a fact that gets nearly enough attention, because his son is more famous. Sneferu built 3 pyramids, and possibly a 4th, and between them they contain more stone than his son's Great Pyramid by a comfortable margin. And what makes them precious is that you can watch him learning. His first attempt at Medum began as a step pyramid, and was then filled in and cased to make the first true smooth-sided pyramid. Something went wrong. The outer casing slid, and today Medum stands as a strange 3-tiered tower rising out of an enormous skirt of its own rubble, looking less like a monument than like a monument in the middle of taking off its coat. His second, at Dashur, was begun at a steep angle of about 54 degrees, and about halfway up the builders evidently noticed cracks appearing in the internal chambers, and made a decision that is visible from 10 miles away. They changed the angle. The upper half rises at 43 degrees instead. It is called the Bent Pyramid, and it is the most human building in Egypt, a 200-foot admission that somebody did the sums wrong and had to save the job. It also still has most of its polished white limestone casing, so you can see what these things were supposed to look like when they were new, which was blinding. And then, having learned, Sneferu built a third one, a mile to the north at the safe angle from the ground up, and it worked perfectly, and it is called the Red Pyramid, and it was the first true smooth-sided pyramid ever completed, and hardly anybody visits it. Then came his son Khufu, and Khufu went to a plateau at Giza, on the edge of the desert overlooking the valley, and built the largest stone building ever raised by anyone anywhere. The Great Pyramid was about 481 feet tall when it was finished, and it stayed the tallest structure on Earth for something in the region of 3,800 years. Until the medieval cathedral builders of Europe finally beat it with a spire that then promptly blew down. Its base covers about 13 acres. Its sides are aligned to true north within a small fraction of a degree, and it contains somewhere around 2 1/3 million blocks of limestone, with an inner core of granite beams brought 500 miles down the river from the quarries at Aswan, some of them weighing 50 or 60 tons. And it was built in about 20 years, which means that if the crews worked every day of every year, they were setting a block roughly every 2 or 3 minutes of daylight for 2 decades. Now, because it is late and you are trying to sleep, I will not build the argument up into a mystery, because there is not one. We know who built it and roughly how. In the 1990s, a village was excavated a few hundred yards from the pyramids, and it turned out to be the workers' town, with bakeries containing bread molds by the hundred, breweries, a fish processing yard, dormitories with long sleeping platforms, and a sizable administrative building. The bones in the workers' cemetery beside it show men and women with the compressed vertebrae and thickened arm bones of very heavy labor, and also, crucially, show set and healed fractures and even a couple of survived amputations, meaning these people were being fed and cared for and given time to mend. They were not enslaved foreigners. That story comes from Herodotus writing 2,000 years later and from the Bible being read carelessly, and the ground does not support it. They were Egyptians working in organized gangs with names like the Friends of Khufu and the Drunkards of Menkaure, cheerfully daubed in red paint on the backs of blocks where nobody was ever supposed to see them. Many were probably rotated in from the villages during the flood months, when the fields were underwater and there was no farming to be done, and a very large number of strong people were suddenly available and needed feeding anyway. We even have the delivery notes. In 2013, at a harbor on the Red Sea coast called Wadi al-Jarf, a French and Egyptian team found the oldest inscribed papyri ever discovered, and among them was the working diary of an inspector named Mera, who commanded a gang of about 40 men in the final years of Khufu's reign. Mera's job was to bring fine white limestone from the quarries at Tura across the river downstream to Giza. And his diary is not poetic in the slightest. It records how many trips they made, how many days it took, where they moored, how the crew were provisioned, and who signed off. It is a timesheet. It is 4,500 years old. It concerns the construction of the Great Pyramid, and it is a timesheet, and I find that more moving than any curse or any secret chamber, because it means the greatest building of the ancient world went up the way large things always go up, by a lot of tired, competent people filling in the paperwork. As for how the blocks got up there, the honest answer is that we do not know the exact arrangement, and that there are 3 or 4 sensible proposals, all of which use ramps of one kind or another, all of which are entirely possible with copper tools and rope and sledges and wet sand and a very large number of organized people. A team working at an alabaster quarry has found the remains of a steep ramp with post holes down both sides, suggesting sledges hauled up on ropes with a kind of ratchet, which would let you pull much more steeply than anyone thought. There is a well-known wall painting from a much later tomb showing an enormous statue being dragged on a sledge while a man standing on the front of it pours water onto the sand in front of the runners, and modern physics has confirmed that damp sand halves the friction, which means that little figure with the water jar, who was for a long time assumed to be performing some ritual, was in fact doing engineering. The blocks were quarried mostly on the spot, from the plateau itself, and you can still see the quarry, a great scooped bite out of the rock south of the pyramid with the tool marks in it. The fine white casing came from across the river. The granite came by boat from the south during the flood, when the water reached almost to the foot of the plateau. And beside the Great Pyramid, in a sealed pit, they buried a boat. In 1954, an archaeologist noticed a line of huge limestone slabs against the pyramid's southern face, lifted one, and looked down into a rock-cut trench that had not been opened for 4,500 years, and smelled cedar. Inside were more than 1,000 pieces of a dismantled ship stacked in order. Unrotted, the wood still fragrant. Reassembled, it is 143 feet long, sewn together with rope through the planks rather than nailed, elegant as a leaf, and entirely seaworthy. Whether it carried the king's body across the river or was meant to carry him across the sky, nobody knows. What is undeniable is that somebody 4,500 years ago took a superb ship apart, laid it out with care so that it could be put back together, and sealed it in the ground for a journey that had not happened yet. Khufu's son Khafre built the second pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller but on higher ground so that it looks taller, and it is the one that still wears its cap of white casing stone at the summit like a hat it forgot to take off. And beside his causeway, cut out of a knob of poor quality limestone left standing in the quarry, crouches the Sphinx, the body of a lion, the head of a king in the royal headcloth, 240 feet long, staring due east at the point on the horizon where the sun comes up at the equinox. It is very likely Khafre's face, though people have argued about that for 2 centuries. Its nose was gone long before Napoleon's soldiers arrived, whatever the stories say. A drawing from the 1400s already shows it missing, and a medieval writer records that it was broken off deliberately by a man offended that peasants were making offerings to it. For most of its life, it has been buried to the neck in sand. And it has been dug out again and again by people who could not bear to leave it like that. The earliest of them, a prince who fell asleep in its chateau while out hunting, dreamed that the Sphinx complained to him about the sand, and later put up a granite slab between its paws recording the whole conversation and the fact that he became king afterwards, which is either a charming piece of piety or the smoothest piece of political propaganda in the ancient world. The third pyramid at Giza, Menkaure's, is much smaller, and people sometimes read that as decline. It is probably better read as sense. Its lower courses were cased in red granite instead of limestone, which is far harder to work and far more expensive. And its temples produce some of the most beautiful sculpture ever made in Egypt, including a series of dark stone triads showing the king flanked by the goddess Hathor and by a personified province, in which the modeling of the muscle and the fall of the linen is so assured that you have to keep reminding yourself these were carved with copper and stone and patience. 4,500 years ago. What the fourth dynasty had done was enormous, but it could not be repeated forever, and the dynasty that followed took the whole enterprise in a different direction. The kings of the fifth dynasty built smaller, sloppier pyramids, sometimes with a rubble core that has since slumped into a shapeless heap, and spent their real money on something else, on temples to the sun. 6 of them built open-air sun sanctuaries near the capital with a squat masonry obelisk standing on a broad platform in an unroofed court, so that the god was worshipped in the open light rather than in a dark inner room. The title Son of Ra becomes standard. And in the very last reign of that dynasty, in the pyramid of a king called Unas at Saqqara, something happens that changes everything for us. If not for them, the walls of the burial chamber are covered from floor to ceiling in small, beautifully carved columns of hieroglyphs painted blue. These are the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in the world, and they are spells for getting a dead king safely into the sky. Some of them are already archaic in the language they use, which means they were old when they were carved. They are strange and fierce and full of images that come from somewhere much further back than the polite state religion. The king climbs a ladder to heaven. The king becomes a star that does not set. The king is a falcon, a bull, a wild goose taking off from the marsh. In one famous and thoroughly alarming passage, the king goes about the sky hunting and consuming the gods themselves in order to absorb their power, which is not the kind of thing you expect to find carved in a royal tomb and which scholars have been trying to soften for a century. And running underneath all of it is a single insistent refrain that catches at you if you sit with it long enough. You have not gone away dead, you have gone away alive. That is what 400 years of pyramid building was for. Not vanity, or not only vanity, a machine for turning a dead man into a star. Around and below those royal monuments spread the cemeteries of everyone else who mattered, the viziers and the overseers of works and the keepers of the royal wig, buried in stone mastabas whose inner rooms are carved with scenes of daily life so detailed that a great deal of what we know about Old Kingdom farming, hunting, boat building, baking, brewing, dancing, wrestling, and cattle counting comes from the walls of the tombs of men who wanted to be sure the good parts of life would continue. In one of them, at Saqqara, a pair of officials named Nianchechnum and Khnumhotep, who shared a title and a tomb, are shown standing face to face with their noses touching and their arms around each other in a pose otherwise reserved for husbands and wives. And no one has ever satisfactorily explained it, and it is one of the tenderest images to survive from the ancient world. In another, a herdsman carries a calf across a ford on his shoulders while the calf turns its head to look back at its mother, and the mother is looking up at the calf, and the water is drawn as a grid of little zigzags with fish in it. And all of this was carved 4,500 years ago by a person who had clearly watched cattle cross a river and had noticed exactly what they do. The sixth dynasty is the last of the Old Kingdom, and it is the one where the cracks start to show, though nobody living through it would have used that word. Its kings were still powerful. They sent expeditions to the turquoise mines of Sinai and to the granite of Aswan and to the incense land somewhere far to the south, and they carved their names on rock faces all over the eastern desert. We have the autobiography of an official named Winnie, carved on a slab in his tomb, who rose from a minor post to command the king's armies and to be trusted with a private matter in the royal household so delicate that he pointedly declines to write down what it was, which is the oldest surviving example of a civil servant being discreet in public and smug about it in private. We have the tomb of a governor at Aswan named Harkuf, who made 4 long journeys south into Nubia and beyond and came back the last time with a dancing dwarf, and who is so proud of the letter the young king sent him about it that he had the entire letter carved on the front of his tomb. It is worth hearing what that letter is like, because it is the only place in 3,000 years where a pharaoh sounds like an actual, excited child. The king, who was about 8, tells Harkuf to come north immediately and bring the dwarf with him, and to make sure he is watched at night in case he falls into the water, and to check on him 10 times a night, and says that he wants to see this dwarf more than all the treasure of the mined lands. 4,300 years later, you can still feel the impatience coming off the stone. That boy grew up to be Pepe II, and according to the king list, he reigned for 94 years, which, if true, would make him the longest reigning monarch in recorded history, and which is exactly the sort of number that historians squint at, since it may be a misreading of 64. Either way, it was very long, and a very long reign is not the blessing it appears to be. Ears die waiting, officials entrench, and meanwhile, something else was happening that had nothing to do with any king. Over the preceding centuries, the crown had been paying its provincial governors in land and exempting temples from tax and letting offices become hereditary, until the men who ran the provinces had estates and workforces and tomb chapels of their own, out in their own districts rather than clustered around the royal pyramid. The governors of Aswan and Mir and Beni Hassan stopped being buried near the king and started being buried at home, in painted rock-cut tombs in the cliffs above their own towns, with their own titles and their own private armies of retainers. Power was quietly draining out of the center and into the provinces, one grant of land at a time, and by the time anybody noticed it, it was structural. And then the river faltered. There is now a fair amount of evidence, from lake sediments and from ice cores and from the pollen record, for a sharp arid episode across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East around 4,200 years ago, roughly at the end of Pepi's reign. In Egypt, that would mean a run of low floods, not one, which is survivable, but many, one after another, so that the black land narrowed and the granaries emptied and the state's whole basis, the tax on the harvest, thinned out. The same episode is visible in the collapse of the empire of Akkad in Mesopotamia and in disruption in the Indus Valley. A century or so of bad weather across half the world. The Old Kingdom did not fall in a battle. It ran out of surplus. What follows is called the First Intermediate Period, and the word intermediate is doing a lot of gentle work because it means the country broke into pieces. For something like 150 years, there was no single king. In the north, a line of kings ruled from a city called Heracleopolis and controlled the delta and the approaches to Memphis. In the south, the governors of a place called Thebes, then an unimportant provincial town on a bend of the river, grew strong enough to declare themselves kings too, and the two houses fought each other up and down the middle of the country. Later Egyptians remembered this era with a shudder, and the literature written afterwards about it is some of the most vivid in the language. Laments describing a world turned upside down, with a man who could not make a pair of sandals now owns chests of treasure, where noble ladies go hungry, where the river is blood and nobody sails north because the roads are watched. Those texts are propaganda, written under the restored monarchy to make people grateful for order, and they should be read the way you read any government's account of what happened before it took charge, because when you look at the archaeology, something quite different appears. In the provincial cemeteries of the First Intermediate Period, the graves are, on average, better furnished than before. More people have coffins. More people have jewelry. More people have the little wooden models of granaries and bakeries and boats and cattle buyers that used to be a royal privilege, and those models are among the most delightful objects Egypt ever produced. Whole workshops in miniature with tiny men kneading tiny dough. Local governors boast in their tomb inscriptions that they fed their districts in the hungry years, dug canals, kept their own herds alive, and did it without waiting for instructions from anywhere. What looks like collapse from the throne looks a great deal like devolution from the village. The greatest change of all was in the afterlife. The spells that had been carved only inside royal pyramids, for kings only, now start appearing painted on the inside of ordinary wooden coffins belonging to provincial officials, adapted, expanded, and addressed to the person lying in them. We call them the coffin texts. It is one of the quietest revolutions in the history of religion. And it happened because the central authority that had been rationing eternity stopped being able to enforce the ration. Once ordinary people had the spells, they never gave them back. Everything later, the Book of the Dead, the weighing of the heart, the judgment hall with its 42 assessors, comes downstream of that. The reunification, when it came from the south. A Theban king named Mentuhotep II of the 11th dynasty spent the first years of his reign consolidating the upper valley and then went north and defeated the Heracleopolitan house. And by his 39th year on the throne he was calling himself Uniter of the Two Lands, which was not a boast but a job description he had personally completed. He was still being worshipped as a founding hero 500 years later. And on the west bank at Thebes, in a great curved bay of golden cliffs at a place called Deir el-Bahari, he built a funerary monument unlike anything before it. Terraces of white limestone rising against the rock face in tiers, fronted by rows of square pillars, with ramps climbing from one level to the next and a grove of tamarisk and sycamore trees planted in pits in front of it. Standing at the foot of a cliff 800 feet high, it must have looked as if the mountain had grown a staircase. Someone would notice that later. Someone would build next door. The Middle Kingdom, which runs from Mentuhotep's reunification to about 1700 years before the Common Era, is the period Egyptians themselves later regarded as their classical age, not the age of the biggest buildings, the age of the best writing, the most correct language, the model kings. When a scribe 200 years afterwards wanted to learn to write properly, he copied Middle Kingdom texts in the way a student of English might be handed a page of the 17th century and told that this is what the language can do when it is behaving. The 11th dynasty gave way to the 12th in a manner that was probably not entirely polite. Mentuhotep's line ended with a king whose chief minister was a man called Amenemhat, and the next king of Egypt was a man called Amenemhat. And while it is not impossible that these are two different people with the same common name, most historians raise an eyebrow and move on. Amenemhat I moved the capital away from Thebes to a new city near the mouth of the Fayum, at the hinge of the country again, and named it Ich-Tawi, meaning Caesar of the Two Lands, which is at least honest. He also did something no previous king had done, and which turned out to be one of the most practical inventions in Egyptian statecraft. He made his son co-ruler while he was still alive. Senusret I reigned alongside his father for 10 years, learning the job, holding the army, and being visibly the heir, so that when the old king died, there was no gap for anyone to climb into. And there very nearly was a gap, because Amenemhat I appears to have been assassinated in a palace conspiracy while his son was away campaigning in Libya, and this event echoes through the literature for centuries afterward in a way that suggests it genuinely frightened people. Two of the greatest works of Egyptian literature come directly out of it. One is a text called The Instruction of Amenemhat, in which the dead king addresses his son from beyond the grave and warns him with real bitterness to trust nobody, not a brother, not a friend, not a servant who has eaten your bread, because it was in the hour after supper, when the palace was quiet and the guards were relaxed, that they came. It is advice literature written as a ghost story, and it is chilling in a way almost nothing else in Egyptian writing is. The other is the tale of Sinuhe, which is simply the finest piece of prose fiction to survive from the ancient world before the Greeks, and which was copied and recopied by schoolboys for 800 years. Sinuhe is a court official who is out with the army in Libya when a messenger arrives with news of the king's death. He overhears it by accident and is so overcome with panic for reasons he never entirely explains and possibly does not understand himself that he simply runs. He runs east across the desert, past the border forts, nearly dies of thirst, is rescued by nomads, and ends up in the land of retinue, in what is now Syria or Lebanon, where a local chieftain takes him in, marries him to his eldest daughter, gives him good land with figs and vines and honey and barley, and where Sinuhe becomes rich and respected and the father of strong sons. He fights a duel with a local champion and wins. He wants for nothing, and he is homesick for 40 years. The most moving passage in the whole story is not any of the adventure, but the letter he finally writes to the new king, begging to be allowed to come back and be buried at home, in which he says that his limbs have grown old and that there is no better thing than that his body should lie in the land where he was born. The king writes back and lets him. And the story ends with the extraordinarily specific joy of a man being given a proper Egyptian burial, the tomb built of stone, the garden laid out, the coffin of gold with a face of lapis, the whole apparatus he had spent 4 decades in a foreign paradise missing. Whatever else it is a story about the fact that comfort and home are different things. The 12th dynasty kings were builders and organizers rather than showmen. They restored the pyramid as a royal tomb, but built them with cores of mud brick faced in stone, which was cheaper and quicker, and has meant that today most of them look like large brown molehills, having lost their facing to later builders who needed the stone. Inside, though, they were fiendish. The pyramid of Amenemhat III at Hawara had a burial chamber cut from a single block of quartzite weighing more than 100 tons, approached through a maze of dead-end passages, sliding trapdoor ceilings, false shafts, and blind chambers, all designed to exhaust and confuse anybody who got in. It did not work. It never works. But you can admire the effort. Their real monument is in the ground and in the water. Southwest of the capital lies the Fayum, a broad natural depression fed by a side branch of the Nile containing a large lake. Over several reigns, the 12th dynasty engineers deepened and regulated that channel, controlled the inflow with sluices, and turned a swampy basin into an enormous reservoir and a vast area of new farmland, adding a whole province to the country by hydraulics. The Greeks who came later were so impressed by the associated temple complex that they gave it a name of its own, the Labyrinth, and Herodotus said flatly that he had seen it and that it was more impressive than the pyramids, which, given what he thought of the pyramids, is quite a claim. It is now almost entirely gone, quarried away to nothing, and we have only the descriptions. Southward, they took the border seriously in a way no earlier dynasty had. Between the first and second cataracts, in the harsh stony corridor of Lower Nubia, Senusret III built a chain of at least 8 enormous mud brick fortresses, and they are not decorative. They have double walls 30 feet thick with rounded bastions, ditches cut into the bedrock, covered stairways down to the river so the garrison could draw water under attack, spur walls with loopholes angled so that arrows could be shot along the face of the wall at anyone approaching it, and drawbridges on rollers. This is serious military architecture. The equal of anything in medieval Europe 3,000 years later, built out of mud brick in the middle of a desert to control a stretch of river. And a boundary stone set up at the fort of Semna carries a decree in which the king states, in the flat voice of a man drawing a line, that he has made his southern boundary here. That no Nubian is to pass it going north by land or by boat except to trade at the appointed place, and that any son of his who fails to hold this line is no son of his. He also, in the same inscription, delivers a series of opinions about his southern neighbors which are, frankly, ugly, and which have not improved with age. Most of those forts are now underwater, drowned by the reservoir behind the modern high dam at Aswan, which is its own kind of irony, a hydraulic project of one era erased by a hydraulic project of another. All of this administration ran on one small class of people, and it is worth sitting for a while with the scribes, because they are the reason we have a story to tell at all. Probably no more than one person in 100 could read and write, and the ones who could were the machinery of the state. A scribe was exempt from forced labor, did not have to plow or carry or dig, could rise from nothing to the highest offices, and was paid in grain. So boys, and occasionally girls, were sent to school at about 5 years old, and sat cross-legged on the floor of a temple courtyard copying passages onto broken potsherds and smooth limestone flakes, because papyrus was far too expensive to waste on children. We have thousands of those flakes, and they are covered in the same handful of texts over and over in wobbling hands with the teacher's corrections in a different ink. Which means we can read Egyptian schoolwork, complete with the bits, where the boy loses concentration halfway down and starts drawing. And one of the texts they were made to copy endlessly for at least 1,000 years is a masterpiece of institutional self-promotion called The Satire of the Trades, in which a father explains to his son why he should apply himself to writing by describing every other job in Egypt in the worst possible light. The metalworker stinks worse than fish roe. The barber wanders the streets exhausting his arms to fill his stomach. The reed cutter works among mosquitoes, the potter is dirtier than a pig, the farmer is worn out by the wheel and the water and the tax collector. The washerman cleans other people's clothes on a riverbank shared with crocodiles. Only the scribe, says the father, sits in comfort, is not shouted at, and gives orders rather than taking them. It is unfair to every one of those trades, and it is also very funny, and the funniest thing about it is imagining a room full of small boys copying out a description of how disgusting a potter is, while their own fathers were, statistically, mostly potters and farmers. Alongside that came the wisdom literature, which is Egypt's other great gift to the world's bookshelf, and which is startling for how little of it is about the gods. The instruction of Ptahhotep, the oldest of them, is a manual of conduct for a young official, and its advice would sit comfortably in any modern book about management. Do not be arrogant because you are learned. Consult the ignorant as well as the wise, because good speech is rarer than emerald, and may be found with a woman grinding at the millstone. If you are in a meeting with someone more powerful than you, keep quiet and let him talk, and if he says something foolish, saying so will not make him wiser and will make you an enemy. If you are the powerful one, listen to a petitioner completely and without interrupting, because a man who has been heard is consoled even when his request is refused. Do not repeat gossip. Do not covet another man's household. Do not answer anger with anger. Be generous to your own dependents, because a good name outlasts an estate. Later collections add the observation that a warm word spoken in a bad situation is worth more than a full storehouse, and that the man who lies awake worrying about tomorrow's wealth will find that the wealth arrives and the sleep does not come back. 4,000 years of hindsight has not improved much on that, and I include it partly because it is good advice, and partly because if you are still awake, you may as well hear the oldest recorded advice about being kind, which is that being heard is most of what people want, and that it costs nothing at all to let somebody finish. Sennacherib III also finished the job that the first intermediate period had started, but from the opposite direction. He abolished the great provincial governorships. The painted cliff tombs of the local dynasty at Beni Hassan and elsewhere simply stopped being made in his reign, and the country is reorganized into 3 great departments run by officials appointed from the capital, who could be moved and removed. It is the birth of a genuine civil service, and Egypt became, for a while, one of the most thoroughly administered places on earth. We know how thoroughly because of a town. At Lahun, beside one of the 12th dynasty pyramids, a whole planned settlement was built to house the workers and priests, and because it was built on desert ground and abandoned intact. Its streets and houses survive. There is a wall dividing the large houses from the small ones, the large houses having up to 70 rooms around courtyards and gardens, the small ones having 4 or 5 rooms and tight terraces, and the ratio between them tells you a great deal about Middle Kingdom society without a single word being written. But words were written, thousands of them, and they were thrown away, and the rubbish survived. From Lahun, and from a fort called Mergissa, and from a rubbish heap at Thebes, we have the actual paperwork of the Middle Kingdom, temple duty rosters, wills, letters about grain, a medical papyrus dealing entirely with the health of women, and a mathematical papyrus setting out how to calculate the volume of a granary, the slope of a pyramid face, and the area of a circle, using a method that amounts to a value for the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter of about 3 1/6, which is impressively close for people working entirely with unit fractions and no algebra whatsoever. There is a papyrus of veterinary medicine about the diseases of cattle. There is a long list of dream interpretations. There is a set of letters written by an irritable farmer named Hekenacht to his family while he is away on business, in which he complains about the household spending, insists that his mother be given proper barley, and threatens to come home. And these letters survive because somebody never delivered them, which is the most human archaeological accident imaginable. And there is the story of the eloquent peasant, in which a peasant is robbed on the road by a minor official and appeals for justice, and speaks so beautifully in his own defense that the high steward deliberately refuses to answer him, so that he will keep coming back and keep speaking, and secretly has every word written down for the king's amusement, while the peasant's family goes hungry at home. It is a story about the machinery of justice that is at once a celebration of eloquence and a rather bleak joke about how the powerful enjoy listening to the powerless. 9 speeches. The peasant incidentally wins in the end and is given everything the official owned. The Middle Kingdom ended the way the Old Kingdom had, not with a bang, but with a slow thinning of the center. The 13th dynasty has around 50 kings in about 150 years, which is an average reign of 3 years, and that number tells the whole story on its own. The bureaucracy carried on. The viziers, whose names we know, seem to have run the country while kings came and went above them like weather. And while the center wobbled, 2 other powers grew up at either end of the valley. In the far south, beyond the Second Cataract, the Nubian kingdom of Kerma had become a serious state in its own right, with a capital of enormous mud brick buildings, one of which, called the Western Defufa, still stands like a small brown mountain, and with royal tombs that are among the largest burial mounds of the ancient world. Kerma took over the abandoned Egyptian forts, sometimes hiring the descendants of the Egyptian garrisons to run them, and controlled the gold routes. And in the north, in the eastern delta, the population had for centuries been mixed. People from Canaan and Syria had been settling there in large numbers, as traders, as sailors, as craftsmen, as soldiers, as workers, and the delta town of Avaris had become a thoroughly Levantine city with Egyptian architecture and Canaanite burials and Minoan-style frescoes of bull leapers on its palace walls, which is an astonishing thing to find in the mud of the eastern Nile. And at some point in the 17th century, before the Common Era, the rulers of that community stopped being subjects and started being kings. Later Egyptian tradition calls them the Hyksos, which is a Greek mangling of an Egyptian phrase meaning rulers of foreign lands, and later Egyptian propaganda describes them as a savage invasion that swept in and burned the temples. The archaeology says otherwise. There is no destruction layer. There is a long, gradual, entirely visible immigration, and then a change of management. It was less a conquest than a takeover of a company by its largest shareholder. The Hyksos kings, the 15th dynasty, ruled the north for about a century from Avaris. They wrote their names in hieroglyphs and cartouches, took Egyptian royal titles, worshipped Set, whom they identified with their own storm god, and kept the Egyptian bureaucracy running. They also brought with them, or accelerated, a whole toolkit of things Egypt did not have: the horse and the light-spoked wheeled chariot, the composite bow, the bronze scale armor, better bronze working generally, the upright loom, new musical instruments, humpback cattle, olive and pomegranate trees. Egypt had been comfortable and self-contained and slightly smug for 1,000 years, and a century of foreign rule shook it out of that permanently. Meanwhile, in the south, the old Egyptian royal line hung on at Thebes as the 17th dynasty, squeezed between the Hyksos in the north and Kerma in the south, paying, one assumes, a certain amount of deference to both. And then, around 1555, before the Common Era, they stopped. There is a story preserved in a school text copied much later and unfortunately broken off just as it gets going, in which the Hyksos king sends a message to the Theban king Sekenenri complaining that the noise of the hippopotamuses in the pools of Thebes is keeping him awake at night, in a city 500 miles away. It is a formal insult, a pretext, a challenge dressed as a complaint about noise, and it is one of the great lost punchlines of history, because the papyrus tears off before we learn what Sekenenri said back. What we do know is what happened to him. His mummy was found in a cache at Thebes in the 1880s, and it is not a restful thing to look at. He was in his 30s, and he died of wounds to the head, and the shape of the wounds matches the axes and daggers the Hyksos army used, and his body was embalmed hurriedly and in some disorder, as though it had come back from a long way off in poor condition and in a hurry. He was a king who died fighting, in the field, at the start of a war his family would finish. His sons finished it. Kamosi took the fleet north and raided as far as Avaris itself, and left an account of it carved on a stone tablet in which he is genuinely, refreshingly furious about the situation, about being a king with a foreigner in the north and a Nubian in the south, and himself squeezed between them, holding a share of a country. He did not live to complete it. His brother, Amosi, did. Over a campaign of some years, Amosi took the delta, besieged and captured Avaris, pursued the retreating Hyksos into southern Canaan and reduced their stronghold there, and then turned around and went south and broke Kerma as well, pushing the frontier deeper into Nubia than any Egyptian king before him. We have that war from the ground level, because an ordinary marine from the town of El-Kab named Amosi, son of Ibana, served through it and had his career carved on the wall of his tomb, listing every action, every promotion, every award of the golden fly, which was Egypt's decoration for persistence in the field, an insect chosen because it keeps coming back at you no matter how often you swat it, which is the most Egyptian piece of military symbolism imaginable. With Ahmose begins the 18th dynasty and the new kingdom, and everything changes in scale. The lesson the Egyptians took from the Hyksos century was simple and permanent. Never again let a threat gather near the border. So Egypt, which for 1,000 years had been an inward-looking river state with a strong army used mainly for expeditions and mines, became an empire with a standing professional army, a chariot corps, garrisons in foreign cities, client kings whose sons were raised at the Egyptian court, has honored hostages, and then sent home thoroughly Egyptianized, and a frontier that ran from the Fourth Cataract in Sudan to the Euphrates in Syria. For the next 500 years, Egypt is one of the great powers of the world, in constant correspondence with the others, and for a good part of that time, it is the richest. The wealth came from 3 places. From Nubia came gold in such quantity that the kings of Babylon and Assyria and Mitanni wrote to Egypt in a tone of frank envy, one of them remarking that in Egypt gold is as common as dust. From Syria and Canaan came tribute, timber, oil, wine, silver, and horses. And from the Red Sea in the far south came incense and ebony and ivory and leopard skins. All of this poured into the temples, and above all into one temple at Thebes, which had been an unimportant provincial town until its local family became kings and made its local god the god of the whole empire. That god was Amun, whose name means the hidden one, and who is fused with the sun god, has Amun-Ra, and whose home was Karnak. Karnak is not a building. It is a walled district a mile around that was continuously enlarged, rebuilt, embellished, and rearranged by at least 30 kings over 2,000 years, and it is the largest religious complex ever constructed by anybody. Successive kings added pylons, which are the great sloping twin towers with the flagpole grooves, so that walking east to west through Karnak is walking backwards through 800 years of ambition, each king building his gateway in front of his predecessors until the entrance is a mile from the sanctuary. There are avenues of ram-headed sphinxes and a sacred lake and obelisks of red granite 90 feet tall, cut in one piece at Aswan and floated down the river on barges, and a hall of 134 columns so thick that a dozen people can stand on top of one, planted so close together that the space between them is more like a stone forest than a room, and the whole ceiling was painted with stars on a blue ground, and the whole interior was painted in colors so strong that the surviving fragments of them under the architraves still look wet. At its height, the Temple of Amun owned a significant fraction of all the arable land in Egypt, tens of thousands of workers, herds numbering in the hundreds of thousands, its own fleet, its own mines, and its own exemptions from tax, and it never gave any of it back, and that fact is going to matter enormously at the end of this story. The first great figure of the new kingdom is not a warrior king, though she took the titles of one. Thutmose I had extended the empire hard in both directions, and his successor Thutmose II died young, leaving an infant son by a secondary wife, and a widow, his own half-sister, named Hatshepsut. She began as regent, which was ordinary. Then, in about the 7th year, she stopped being regent and became king, which was not. Egypt had had women rule before, briefly and in emergencies, but never like this, a full coronation, the 5 royal names, a 22-year reign, and a systematic program of building and trade. Her statues show her in the full royal regalia, with the kilt and the headcloth and a ceremonial false beard, sometimes with a woman's face and body, and sometimes with a man's, because the Egyptian language and the Egyptian image system had no vocabulary for a female king, and she was not going to wait for one to be invented. Her inscriptions frequently switch pronouns mid-sentence, which scholars once treated as confusion, and which reads far more naturally as a person using every available tool at once. Her monument is the terraced temple at Deir el-Bahari, built directly beside Mentuhotep's 500-year-old one and utterly outclassing it, 3 colonnaded terraces of white limestone rising against the golden cliff, joined by long ramps so severe and so modern in its proportions that architects still photograph it. On its walls she carved the 2 things she was proudest of. One is her divine birth, a scene sequence in which the god Amun visits her mother in the form of her father, and the child is fashioned on a potter's wheel and presented to the gods, which is the standard royal legitimacy claim deployed with unusual thoroughness. The other is the expedition to Punt. Punt was a land far to the south, probably on the coast of Eritrea or Somalia, or possibly across in Arabia, and it was the source of frankincense and myrrh, and Egypt had traded with it for 1,000 years, but rarely directly. Hatshepsut sent 5 ships. The relief showing them is one of the treasures of ancient art. The vessels under sail with their rigging drawn accurately enough for naval historians to argue about. The round houses of Punt on stilts with ladders up to their doors. The fish of the Red Sea drawn so precisely that modern zoologists can identify a dozen species. The loaded cargo of ebony and ivory and gold and apes and hides, and the chief of Punt with his wife, who is drawn with a striking and quite unflattering realism that has generated 100 years of medical speculation, and most importantly, the trees. She brought back 31 living incense trees with their root balls wrapped, carried on poles between men, and planted them in the terrace gardens in front of her temple so that Egypt could grow its own incense. The pits they were planted in are still there in the rock. You can stand in front of them. When Hatshepsut died, her stepson finally took sole power, and Thutmose III turned out to be the most effective soldier Egypt ever produced. He campaigned 17 times in 20 years, and his scribes kept a daily record which was later copied onto the walls at Karnak, and it is the oldest detailed battle account in existence. The first campaign is the famous one. A coalition of Canaanite and Syrian princes had gathered at Megiddo, a fortress commanding the pass through the Carmel Ridge, and there were 3 roads to it, 2 easy and wide, and 1 a narrow track through a defile so tight that the army would have to go through in single file, horse behind horse, with the front of the column emerging while the rear had not yet entered. His officers argued, politely and at length, for one of the safe roads. He took the narrow one and led from the front and came out onto the plain behind the enemy while they were still watching the other approaches. He then won the battle so comprehensively that the entire opposing army fled inside the walls of the city, and here the account becomes wonderfully honest about human nature, because the Egyptian troops stopped to loot the abandoned camp instead of pursuing. And so the enemy princes were hauled up over the walls on knotted sheets. And Thutmose had to sit outside Megiddo for 7 months instead of taking it in an afternoon. He built a ditch and a palisade around the whole city, harvested the enemy's own grain fields to feed his men, and waited. It fell. He took, among other things, more than 900 chariots and 2,000 horses, and he made a point of writing down the exact numbers and the exact quantity of grain. Because Thutmose was an accountant as much as a general, he was also a curious man. On the walls of a small room at Karnak, he had carved a collection of the plants and animals he had brought back from Syria, more than 270 species, drawn individually and labeled, purely because he found them interesting, and it is the oldest botanical garden in the world, existing only as a picture of itself. Late in his life, or possibly under his son, someone went around the monuments of Hatshepsut and had her name and image chiseled out and replaced with those of other kings, and for a century this was told as the story of a resentful stepson taking revenge on the aunt who stole his throne. The dates do not support it. The erasure begins decades after her death, long after any personal grudge would have cooled, and it is selective rather than total, and the current best guess is that it was a piece of tidy dynastic housekeeping, removing an anomalous female king from the official sequence so the succession would read cleanly from father to son, which is, if anything, a colder motive than hatred. Her mummy was probably found in 1903 in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, lying on the floor beside her wet nurse, unidentified for a century, until a tooth in a labeled box elsewhere in the museum was found to fit a gap in her jaw. That is the Valley of the Kings, incidentally, and it deserves a moment. Beginning with Thutmose I, the New Kingdom pharaohs gave up on pyramids entirely, having noticed the obvious flaw, which is that a pyramid is a large sign saying that treasure is buried underneath it. Instead, they cut their tombs into the rock of a dry valley behind the western cliffs at Thebes, a place with no monuments, no roads, and a natural pyramid-shaped peak standing over it, which was itself sacred and which meant the mountain was doing the symbolism for free. The tombs are long descending corridors cut hundreds of feet into the limestone, with pillared halls and a burial chamber at the bottom. And the walls are covered not with scenes of daily life, but with the great books of the underworld, hour by hour, maps of the sun's night journey, with all its gates and its guardians and their names, because knowing the name is what lets you pass. The workmen who cut them lived in a walled village in a hollow between the valleys called Deir el-Medina for 400 years, and because they were literate craftsmen who wrote everything down on chips of limestone and threw them away, and because their village was in a desert. We know more about the daily life of these particular ordinary people than about any other community in the ancient world. We have their attendance registers, with the reasons for absence noted, brewing beer, building his house, embalming a relative, ill, stung by a scorpion, quarreling with his wife. We have their letters, their loans, their divorces, their lawsuits about a stolen donkey, their love poems, their doodles, and a sketch of a cat serving wine to a mouse in a chair, which is the oldest surviving satirical cartoon and which does not need translating. The empire reached its comfortable height under Amenhotep III, who reigned nearly 40 years without fighting anything worth mentioning, which is the sincerest measure of his predecessor's success. He built more than any king before him, the Temple of Luxor with its colonnade of papyrus columns 50 feet high, additions all over Karnak, an enormous mortuary temple on the west bank of which almost nothing survives except the two seated colossi that stood at its gate and still stand there, 70 feet tall, in a field, having outlived the entire building behind them. One of them cracked in an earthquake and afterwards used to give out a musical note at sunrise as the dew evaporated out of the fissure, and the Greeks and Romans made a tourist attraction of it, and Roman visitors carved their names on the legs, complaining or boasting about whether it had sung for them, until an emperor helpfully repaired the statue, and it never sang again. He also dug a pleasure lake for his queen, a mile long, and commemorated it on a scarab, and issued commemorative scarabs the way a modern government issues stamps, recording his marriages, his lion hunts, the arrival of a foreign princess with her retinue of 317 women. And his queen was Tie, who was not of royal birth, whose parents were commoners of some standing, whose intact tomb was found with their furniture and their wigs, and who appears in her husband's monuments at the same size as him, which in Egyptian art is a statement of power, and who is named in the diplomatic correspondence of foreign kings as somebody worth writing to directly. That correspondence, by the way, survives. In 1887, a peasant woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins of a later capital found a cache of clay tablets, and they turned out to be the Egyptian Foreign Office archive. More than 300 letters between the pharaohs and the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, the Hittites, Cyprus, and dozens of small vassal cities in Canaan. Written in Akkadian, which was the international language of the day. They are extraordinary. They are also, quite often, extremely petty. Great kings address each other as brother and then complain that the gold sent last time was underweight, or that the messenger was detained too long, or that the sender did not ask after their health with sufficient warmth, or that a promised statue of solid gold has arrived made of wood with gold plating, which is precisely the sort of thing that happens when procurement is left to underlings. And from the Canaanite vassals come letter after letter begging for troops that never arrive, warning that the neighboring mayor is disloyal, that the roving bands in the hills are taking the villages, that if 50 archers do not come, the city will fall. Diplomacy has not changed. It is exactly this in every century. And while all of that was going on in the palaces and the archives and the temple treasuries, the boy on the roof was still there. Not the same boy, obviously, 30 generations of boys and their sisters and their mothers and grandmothers, sitting on the same flat mud brick roofs in the same villages between the same two deserts, watching the same water come up over the same fields in the same month of the same year. That is the thing to hold on to, underneath the kings. For the vast majority of the people in this story, almost nothing changed for 3,000 years. The house was mud brick with a stair to the roof, because the roof is where you sleep when the nights are hot. The bread was emmer wheat, ground on a stone saddle, and it wore people's teeth down to stumps by their 40s because of the grit off the grindstone. The beer was thick and slightly sour and nourishing, and everybody drank it, including children, because it was safer than the canal. There were onions and garlic and lettuce and cucumber and lentils and chickpeas and dates and figs and pomegranates once the Hyksos brought them, and fish from the river dried on the roof, and goose for a feast, and beef only if you were wealthy or if it was a festival and the temple was distributing meat. Cats lived in the house and were genuinely loved and were mourned when they died. Dogs had names, and we know dozens of them, because people had them written on their collars: Blackie, Brave One, Reliable, Good Herdsman, and one marvelously called Useless. Children played with wooden animals with jointed jaws that opened when you pulled a string, and with balls of rag, and with a game played with sticks and a hole in the ground that is still played in the same villages. Marriage was a private arrangement with a property contract and no religious ceremony that we can find. Women could own land, run businesses, sue, give evidence, inherit equally with their brothers, and initiate divorce, which put them in a position better than most European women enjoyed until embarrassingly recently. And when the flood came in, work stopped, and the whole country sat on its roofs for a few weeks with nothing to do but watch the water and wait, which is possibly why the Egyptians left behind so many board games. And then Amenhotep III died, and his son came to the throne, and Egypt had the strangest 17 years in its history. He began as Amenhotep IV in the ordinary way, and within a few years he had changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning something like effective for the Aten, and had shut down the temples of the other gods, dispersed their priesthoods, cut off their income, sent men around the country with chisels to remove the name of Amun from every monument, including from his own father's name, and had moved the entire capital of Egypt to a virgin site in the middle of nowhere, on a curve of desert plain enclosed by cliffs halfway between Thebes and Memphis, where no god had ever held property. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, and we call it Amarna. He built it from nothing in about 4 years, using small, standardized blocks a single man could carry, which is why it went up so fast and why it came down so fast afterwards. And the god he worshipped there was not a figure with an animal head. It was the physical disk of the sun, shown as a plain circle with rays coming down from it, and each ray ending in a small human hand, and some of those hands holding the sign of life to the nostrils of the king and his family. Not a statue, not a face, a source of light with hands. Whether this makes Akhenaten the first monotheist is one of the oldest arguments in Egyptology, and the honest answer is that it depends on how you count. He did not permit the worship of other gods, and he attacked one of them specifically and viciously. And the great hymn to the Aten which survives on a courtier's tomb wall is genuinely, startlingly beautiful. Praising a single creator who made the Nile in the sky, has rain for foreign peoples, and the Nile under the earth for Egypt, who gives every land what it needs, who makes the chick speak inside the shell. Parts of it run so close to the words of one of the Psalms of the Hebrew Bible that scholars have been comparing them, cautiously, for 150 years. But the ordinary Egyptian was not invited to worship the Aten directly. Only the king could do that. The people were to worship the king, who worshipped the disk. It is less a reformation than an extremely elegant concentration of everything into one household. And the art. Something happened to Egyptian art in these years that never happened before or since. The rigid canon relaxed, and the royal family are shown with long faces, heavy-lidded eyes, thin necks, narrow shoulders, wide hips, and swollen abdomens in poses of a domesticity that is unthinkable in any other reign. The king and queen sitting facing each other with their daughters clambering across their laps, the king lifting a child to kiss her, the family eating a meal, the whole group leaning slightly and softly toward each other under the rays with their little hands. For a long time, the physical strangeness of these images was explained as a medical condition, and various syndromes have been proposed and defended and demolished. The likelier explanation is that this is a theological style, that the king had himself and his family depicted as something between male and female, something bigger than a body, because the Creator God was both mother and father, and the royal family were his image on earth. It is doctrine drawn as anatomy. And beside him through all of it stands Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one has come, and who is shown at the same scale as her husband. In the chariot with him, at the window of appearances beside him, and in one relief in the pose reserved for a pharaoh subduing an enemy, which is not a thing queens are drawn doing. Her painted limestone bust, found in a sculptor's workshop at Amarna in 1912, still with the plaster models of other courtiers on the shelves around it, is one of the most reproduced human faces in the world. It is unfinished. One eye was never inlaid. It was a master model, kept in the studio so that other artists could copy the official likeness, which means the most famous face of the ancient world is technically a reference sheet. Outside the sunlit courts of the new capital, the empire was being neglected. The letters from the Canaanite vassals get more desperate in these years, and Egyptian control in Syria thinned while the Hittites pushed south. Inside the city, the excavated workers' housing and the cemetery tell a harsher story than the reliefs, a population under real strain with heavy labor injuries, poor nutrition, and a great many people who died young. Building an ideal city in a desert in 4 years is expensive in a currency that does not appear in the inscriptions. And then Akhenaten died, and the whole thing came apart with astonishing speed. There are 1 or 2 shadowy rulers in between, one of them bearing a throne name that many scholars now think belongs to Nefertiti herself, ruling in her own right at the end. And then the throne passed to a boy of about 9, a son of Akhenaten by another wife, whose name was Tutankhaten, and within a couple of years the court had left Amarna, gone back to Memphis and Thebes, reopened the temples, restored the priesthoods, and changed the boy's name to Tutankhamun. A stela set up in his reign describes the state of the country before the restoration with brutal frankness, the temples fallen into ruin, the shrines overgrown, the gods turning their backs on the land, and armies sent to Syria coming back with nothing at all. Later king lists simply omitted Akhenaten and his immediate successors. Where they had to be mentioned, he was called the enemy, or that criminal of Akhenaten. His city was abandoned, its stone blocks carted off and used as rubble field inside other kings' pylons, where they were found thousands at a time in the 20th century, still bearing their sunlit reliefs, packed face inward in the dark for 3,000 years. Egypt tried thoroughly and deliberately to forget the whole episode, and very nearly succeeded, and the only reason we know about any of it is that the material they buried it under preserved it perfectly. Tutankhamun ruled for about 9 years and died at 19, and in political terms, he is a footnote. He restored what the priests wanted restored. He was probably managed by two much older men, and he did not live long enough to do anything of his own. He matters for one reason, which is an accident of geography. His tomb was small, hastily prepared, and cut low in the floor of the Valley of the Kings, and a couple of centuries later, the workmen, cutting a much grander tomb for a Ramesside king above it, dumped their rubble down the slope and buried the entrance under several feet of flint chips, and then built their huts on top of the pile. Everything else in that valley was robbed, mostly within a few generations. This one was not. In November of 1922, after 6 seasons of finding nothing and with his patron's patience exhausted and the funding due to stop, an English excavator named Howard Carter had his men clear the last untouched patch of ground in the valley under the old workmen's huts. And on the 4th of November, a water boy scraping a hole for a jar uncovered a step cut in the rock. 16 steps down there was a plastered doorway with intact seal impressions. Behind it a rubble-filled corridor, and behind that a second sealed door, and Carter made a small hole in the top left corner of it and pushed a candle through, and stood there for a long time without speaking, while his patron asked him repeatedly whether he could see anything. What he said in reply is one of the great understatements of the century, and it was the truth. Everywhere the glint of gold. 4 small rooms, densely packed, floor to ceiling, 5,398 objects, chariots dismantled to get them through the door. Beds with legs carved as cows and lions and hippopotami, chairs, chests, gaming boards, walking sticks, sandals, linen underwear, 130 walking canes, folding camp beds, model boats, jars of honey and of wine labeled by vineyard and vintage, baskets of fruit, mummified joints of meat packed for the journey in specially made cases, and 2 life-sized guardian figures in black and gold standing on either side of a sealed door with their staffs, facing each other, waiting. Behind that door, 4 gilded wooden shrines nested one inside the other like boxes, filling the entire burial chamber with barely room to squeeze around them. Inside them, a stone sarcophagus. Inside that, 3 coffins, the innermost of solid gold, weighing about 240 pounds. And inside that, the boy, with a mask of gold and lapis and carnelian and glass over his face, the most recognizable object ever recovered from the ground. Clearing it took 10 years, because Carter, to his enormous credit and against every commercial pressure, insisted on recording, photographing, conserving, and numbering everything before it moved. And the discovery went round the world in a way no archaeological find had before, because it happened in the age of the illustrated newspaper and the newsreel. It gave the 1920s their design language, put lotus columns on cinema fronts in Ohio and sphinxes on cigarette cases in Paris, and it produced the tabloid story about a curse which was invented by the press within days. Sustained by the unfortunate death of Carter's patron from an infected mosquito bite 5 months later, and comprehensively demolished by the fact that Carter himself, who opened everything, lived another 17 years. The truly interesting thing about the tomb is not the gold. It is that this was a minor king, buried in a hurry, in someone else's small tomb, with some of the equipment visibly reused from an earlier burial and hastily recarved. If that was the modest version, than the tomb of a great king of the new kingdom, laid in a chamber 10 times the size at the end of a corridor 300 feet long, is a quantity of worked precious metal that the mind refuses to hold. All of it went, every ounce, within a few centuries, back into circulation. After Tutankhamun, the dynasty ran out of heirs, and here occurs one of the strangest documents of the ancient world. A widowed Egyptian queen, almost certainly his, wrote to the king of the Hittites, the very empire Egypt had been fighting, and said that her husband had died, that she had no son, that she would not marry a servant of her own, and asked him to send one of his sons to be her husband and king of Egypt. The Hittite king could not believe it, and sent an envoy to check whether it was a trick, which cost months. When he finally sent a son, the prince was killed on the road before he reached the border, and the Hittites went to war over it. And the war brought a plague back into their homeland, which killed their king and much of their population. An entire empire fell ill because of a letter. The throne went instead to the old officials, first to A, the elderly courtier, and then to Horemheb, the general, who reigned for nearly 30 years, reorganized the law, restored the temples, dismantled the last of Akhenaten's buildings for hardcore, and had no son either, and so handed the crown to his vizier, an army man from the eastern delta with a family tradition of soldiering named Ramesses. And so begins the 19th dynasty and the Ramesside age, the last great blaze of imperial Egypt. Ramesses I reigned less than 2 years. His son Seti I was a serious king who pushed hard back into Canaan and Syria, restored the vandalized monuments, and built at Abydos a temple of white limestone, whose carved reliefs are the finest of any period, so delicate that the muscles of the arms and the folds of the linen are modeled in relief barely a finger's breadth deep, and whose walls carry a list of the names of 76 previous kings, from Narmer down to Seti himself. It is the closest thing we have to an official Egyptian history of Egypt, and it is a beautiful lie, because Hatshepsut is not on it, and neither is Akhenaten, nor Tutankhamun, nor A. The list runs smoothly from father to son across 2,000 years, with every awkwardness quietly deleted. It is an official portrait with the inconvenient relatives cropped out, and it was carved in stone in a temple, which is a reminder that permanence and accuracy are not at all the same thing. And then his son. Ramesses II reigned 66 years, lived into his early 90s, fathered somewhere around 100 children, and covered the country in his own name so comprehensively that for centuries afterwards, travelers assumed he had built everything in Egypt. He built the Ramesseum on the west bank, whose fallen colossus, 70 feet of granite lying broken in the sand, prompted a young English poet who had never been within 2,000 miles of it to write a sonnet about a shattered statue in a desert whose inscription boasts of works that no longer exist. And that poem is now, for most of the English-speaking world. The only thing they know about him, which he would have found intolerable, and which is, of course, exactly the poem's point. He completed the hypostyle hall at Karnak. He finished Luxor and stood 2 obelisks and 6 colossal statues of himself in front of it, and one of those obelisks now stands in the middle of a traffic circle in Paris. Having been given away in the 1830s in exchange for a mechanical clock which never worked properly, and which is still not working properly in the Citadel in Cairo, a trade that ranks among the least successful in diplomatic history. And far to the south, in Nubia at Abu Simbel, He had a cliff of sandstone cut away, and 4 seated figures of himself 65 feet high carved out of the living rock in a row, with the temple hollowed out behind them, running 200 feet into the mountain, so aligned that on 2 mornings of the year the rising sun comes straight down the axis and lights the statues of the gods in the innermost sanctuary, all except the god of darkness who stays in shadow. In the 1960s, that entire mountain was cut into more than 1,000 blocks, some weighing 30 tons, lifted and reassembled 200 feet higher and 200 yards back, ahead of the rising reservoir, inside an artificial concrete dome disguised as a hill. The alignment now happens a day later than it used to, which is the only detectable error, and which strikes me as a remarkably small margin for having moved a mountain. Beside his 4 colossi stand the much smaller figures of his family, and next door is a second temple for his queen, Nefertari, with 6 standing figures on its front, 4 of him and 2 of her. And here is the unusual part. The 2 of her are the same height as the 4 of him. He wrote about her in the dedication in a way no pharaoh had written about a wife before, saying that the sun rises for her sake, and her tomb in the Valley of the Queens, when it was opened, turned out to hold the most beautiful painted walls in Egypt, with the ceiling a deep blue field of golden stars and the plaster colors as fresh as the week they dried. What he is most famous for, though, is a battle he did not win. In his 5th year, he marched north with something over 20,000 men in 4 divisions to take the city of Kadesh on the Orontes from the Hittites. 2 captured scouts told him, plausibly and at length, that the Hittite army was far away to the north, and he believed them and hurried ahead with only the 1st Division to camp outside the city. The scouts were plants. The entire Hittite army, with 2,500 chariots, was hidden behind the city, and it came around the walls and smashed through the 2nd Division as it was marching up in column and burst into the Egyptian camp. What appears to have saved the day is a combination of the Hittite chariots stopping to loot, a separate Egyptian force arriving unexpectedly from the coast at the critical moment, and Ramesses himself, aged about 25, fighting on the spot with his household troops instead of running. By evening, the Egyptians held the field. But he did not take Kadesh, and he went home, and the frontier stayed roughly where it had been. So he came back and had the battle carved on the walls of at least 5 temples in enormous detail in 2 separate texts and a picture cycle, describing how he was abandoned by his troops and surrounded by 2,500 chariots and prayed to Amun and was answered and charged the enemy 6 times alone. It is the most extensively publicized near disaster in history. And the truly funny part, the part that makes the whole thing modern, is that we also have the Hittite version from their archives, and they say they won. 16 years later, the 2 empires, both exhausted and both nervously watching the rise of Assyria, signed a peace treaty. We have it from both ends. The Egyptian version carved on the walls at Karnak and the Ramesseum, and the Hittite version on baked clay tablets from their capital, and the 2 texts match closely enough that you can see they were negotiated word by word. Mutual non-aggression, a defensive alliance, the extradition of fugitives with an explicit and rather humane clause that the extradited person is not to be punished or have his household harmed, and a guarantee of the succession in both kingdoms. It is the oldest surviving international peace treaty in the world, and a copy of it hangs on the wall at the headquarters of the United Nations. And it held. It held for the rest of both kingdoms' existence, which turned out to be less time than anyone expected. His son, Merneptah, who came to the throne already elderly, having outlived 12 older brothers, faced the first wave of something new, a coalition of Libyans and of seaborne peoples from the north and west, moving not as raiders, but as migrants, with their families and their cattle and their carts looking for somewhere to live. He beat them, and on a victory stela recording the campaign there appears in a list of defeated peoples in Canaan, a name that has been argued over more than almost any other 3 signs in Egyptology, because it is the earliest known mention of Israel. Written with the marker that indicates a people rather than a place. 30 years later, the wave came again, much larger. The whole of the eastern Mediterranean was coming apart. Within a few decades, around 1200, before the Common Era, the Hittite Empire vanished completely, the great Canaanite trading city of Ugarit burned, the Mycenaean palaces of Greece burned, Cyprus was overrun. The trade routes that carried the tin required to make bronze failed, and a densely interconnected international world that had lasted centuries collapsed almost simultaneously. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, and the causes were probably a compound of drought, famine, earthquake, internal revolt, and migration, all reinforcing one another. Egypt is the only great power of that world that survived it, and it survived because of Ramesses III of the 20th dynasty, who fought the Sea Peoples twice on land and once in the mouths of the Nile, where he trapped their fleet against the shore, lined the banks with archers, and destroyed them in the shallows. The reliefs at his temple at Medinet Habu show the sea battle in a tangle of capsizing ships and men in the water and feathered headdresses, and it is the earliest depiction of a naval engagement anywhere. Egypt held. But it held the way a wall holds after the flood, still standing and permanently weakened. In the same reign, in the 29th year. Something else happened that had never happened before in 3,000 years of recorded history, and it happened at Deir el-Medina, and we know about it because those literate workmen wrote everything down. The rations did not arrive. The workmen who cut the royal tombs were paid in grain, and the grain came late, and then came short, and then did not come. And so they downed their copper chisels, walked out of the valley past the checkpoints, and sat down in the mortuary temple of Thutmose III, in the middle of a sacred precinct where nobody could remove them without committing an offense against a god, and refused to move until they were fed. When officials came to talk to them, one of the workmen said that they had come here because they were hungry and thirsty, and that there was no clothing, no ointment, no fish, no vegetables, and told them to write to the Pharaoh and to the vizier and get them something to live on. It is the first recorded strike in human history. They got their grain. They also had to do it again several times over the following years, which will surprise nobody who has ever been in a dispute with an employer. Since we are standing outside the tombs with the men who cut them, this is the right moment to say what all that work was actually for, because the Egyptian idea of death is the thing most people half know, and it is stranger and gentler than the half-knowledge suggests. They did not think of a person as one item. A person was a bundle of parts that had to be kept together and supplied. There was the body, which mattered, physically, permanently. There was the name, which had to be spoken and written, and which was destroyed if the writing was destroyed. There was the shadow. There was the ba, usually drawn as a bird with a human head, which was the part that could move, leave the tomb, fly out into the daylight, and come back at night. and which is why tomb shafts were left connected to the world above. And there was the Ka, the life force which stayed with the body and which needed feeding, which is why every tomb chapel has an offering table and a false door, and why the essential job of a son was to bring bread and beer and to say the offering formula out loud, and why the formula was carved on the wall in the first place, so that any literate passerby who read it aloud would be doing the work for free. If all of those parts could be kept intact and provisioned, the dead person became an ach, an effective spirit, able to act, able to help the living, able to go west and be received. So the body had to last. The technique took centuries to perfect, and by the New Kingdom it was a profession with grades of service and a fixed price list. It took 70 days. The internal organs were removed through an incision in the left side, all but the heart, which stayed where it was because the heart was where thought and character and memory lived, and the brain, which was removed through the nose with a hooked rod and discarded without ceremony, because nobody had the faintest idea what it was for. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were dried separately and put in 4 jars under the protection of 4 minor gods with a human, a baboon, a jackal, and a falcon head. Then the body was packed inside and out with natron, a natural salt from a desert lake bed northwest of Memphis, and left for 40 days until every drop of water was gone, because water is what decay needs. Then it was washed, rubbed with oils and resins and spices. The cavities were packed with linen and sawdust and sweet-smelling material. False eyes were sometimes set under the lids, and then the wrapping began. Hundreds of yards of linen strip laid down in prescribed layers with prayers said over each one, and amulets slipped between them, the scarab over the heart, the pillar of stability at the throat, the eye of Horus, the little headrest and ladders and staircases. The whole of it was an argument, in physical form, against the idea that a person can simply stop. And then the funeral and the procession, and at the door of the tomb, the priest holding the upright mummy while the sun touched its mouth with an adze in the ceremony of the opening of the mouth, so that the dead could eat and speak, and a last meal eaten by the family at the tomb door, and the sealing and the sweeping of the sand behind them, so that no footprints remained. And then the journey, which is the part they wrote the books for. Rolled into the wrappings or laid beside the body was a papyrus we call the Book of the Dead, though the Egyptian name is better, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It is not a scripture, it is a manual. Around 200 spells, of which any one copy might have 30 or 100, arranged to be used in order with pictures. Spells for not dying a second time, spells for remembering your own name, spells for turning into a swallow or a heron or a lotus or a crocodile if a particular gate requires it, spells for stopping your heart from being taken away from you, and spells for making sure your shadow keeps up. There is a spell for not having to walk upside down, which suggests somebody somewhere had a very bad dream about it. And at the center is the great scene, the one painted 1,000 times, the one that decides everything, the Hall of Judgment. The dead person is led in by the jackal-headed god of the cemeteries, and in the middle of the room stands a balance, and on one pan is placed the heart of the dead, and on the other a single ostrich feather, the feather of Mot. Truth, order, the way things ought to be. And the dead person has to speak in front of 42 assessors, one for each province, and deny to each of them a particular wrong, not a confession. a negative confession, item by item. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not taken milk from the mouth of a child, I have not driven cattle from their pasture, I have not stopped water when it should flow, I have not diverted the water of a canal from my neighbor's field, I have not added to the weight of the balance, I have not been deaf to words of truth. Read the whole list and you can reconstruct Egyptian ethics from the back. What they actually cared about at the very end, when it mattered, was largely about water, land boundaries, honest weights, animals, and not being cruel to people who could not stop you. The ibis-headed god of writing stands by with his palette, recording, and crouching under the balance, watching. Is a small composite creature with the head of a crocodile, the front of a lion, and the back of a hippopotamus, which is called the devourer, and which is there for the heart that fails. Now here is what tells you the most about the Egyptians. Among the spells in the book there is one, spell 30b, whose entire purpose is to address your own heart and instruct it not to testify against you. Do not stand up as a witness against me, it says. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not tip the scale. And it was written on the flat underside of a scarab amulet and placed on the chest right over the heart, so that it would be reading it all the way down. They built the most elaborate moral examination in the ancient world, and then they cheated on it, tenderly, with a note tucked into their own chest, because they loved their dead and could not bear the thought of them failing. And past the balance, if the heart balanced, there was not a paradise of clouds. There was a field. The field of reeds, which is Egypt again, the same Egypt with the same river and the same canals and the same black soil. Only the harvest is always good, and the flood is always right, and the shade is always where you want it, and nobody is hungry. That is the whole of Egyptian heaven, this forever, without the bad years. It is the most touchingly unambitious afterlife anybody has ever imagined, and I think there is a great deal of dignity in it. They did not want a different world. They wanted this one to keep working. Which brings us back to the 20th dynasty and to the sad, slow, well-documented end of the New Kingdom. After Ramesses III, the kings get shorter reigns and weaker grip. Grain prices, which we can actually track from the receipts, rise sharply and stay high for decades, which in a country whose whole economy is grain means genuine hardship for ordinary households. The empire in Asia is gone. The gold of Nubia is no longer reliably arriving. Libyan settlers are moving into the western delta in numbers and being enrolled in the army and increasingly commanding it. And in the west of Thebes, the wealth that was lying in the ground finally proved irresistible. Because if you cannot pay the workmen who dug the tombs, sooner or later somebody is going to notice that the workmen know exactly where the tombs are. We have the court records. In the reign of Ramesses IX, a commission of inquiry was appointed to investigate the plundering of the royal cemeteries, and the papyri that record the hearings are among the most vivid documents in Egyptian, because they include the actual testimony. A stonemason describes tunneling into a royal tomb with copper chisels, breaking into the chamber, opening the coffins, stripping the gold from the mummies and dividing the take 8 ways on the spot. Another witness describes finding the burial of a queen, still intact, with her jewelry on her. There are lists of who was involved, and the list is uncomfortable, not just laborers, but scribes, temple staff, guards, and at least one member of the local administration, which is to say that the theft of the ancestors was being run by the same class of people who were supposed to be protecting them. There is a marvelous procedural moment where the accused are taken across the river to the tomb they are charged with robbing, to demonstrate whether they could have got in, and one of them fails to find the entrance and is released. And the whole inquiry then descends into a political fight between the mayor of the East Bank and the mayor of the West Bank, each accusing the other of covering it up. It has all the flavor of a modern corruption trial, 3,100 years old, complete with a depressing conclusion that some of the convicted were punished severely and some of the well-connected were not. The eventual official response was not to stop it, but to formalize it, under the last kings of the dynasty and their successors. The priests of Amun went systematically through the Valley of the Kings, opened the royal burials themselves, stripped off the remaining gold for the state treasury, rewrapped the bodies with care, wrote little notes on the bandages recording who they were and when they had been restored, and reburied them all together in 2 or 3 secret hiding places for safekeeping. Which is why, in 1881, a single small tomb at Deir el-Bahari turned out to contain some 50 mummies, including Seqenenre, Ahmose, Thutmose III, Seti I and Ramesses II, stacked in a corridor with their labeled coffins, and why the greatest kings of the greatest age of Egypt survive at all. They were saved by the pragmatic decision of a later administration to melt down their coffins and keep their bodies. And there is a strange and lovely postscript to that. When those mummies were moved to a new museum in Cairo in 2021, they were carried through the city at night in 22 decorated vehicles with an honor guard, along streets lined with people, past temples and monuments, with the road specially resurfaced so that the ride would be smooth. 3,000 years after the priest wrote their careful notes on the bandages, somebody was still worrying about whether the journey would be comfortable. The last king of the 20th dynasty, Ramesses XI, ruled a country that had effectively split in 2 under him. In the north, the vizier ran things from the delta. In the south, the high priest of Amun at Thebes ruled as a king in all but name, and eventually dropped the qualification and had himself drawn in royal costume on a temple wall at the same size as the Pharaoh, which in the grammar of Egyptian art is a declaration of independence. The temple of Amun had accumulated so much of the country's land and revenue over 500 years of pious royal donations that it had quietly become the state, and when the state weakened, the temple did not prop it up. It replaced it. There is a document from the very end of this period which is the best possible epitaph for the empire. It is the report of an elderly priest named Wenaman, sent from Thebes up the coast to Byblos in Lebanon to buy cedar for the sacred bark of Amun. 200 years earlier, a pharaoh's agent would have simply requisitioned the timber. Wenaman is robbed on the way, cannot get compensation, arrives with almost nothing, and is kept waiting outside the harbor for 29 days by the prince of Byblos, who sends a message every single morning telling him to get out. When he is finally granted an audience, the prince has the old ledgers brought out and points out that his ancestors did indeed send timber to Egypt, and were paid for it, in full, and that he is not the servant of Egypt, and neither was his father, and that the god Amun may well own the sea and the cedar, but the shipping is going to be invoiced. Wenaman has to send home for payment and wait for it to arrive, and he does get his timber, and then he is blown off course to Cyprus and nearly lynched. And the papyrus breaks off in the middle of him talking his way out of it. It is written with a sort of exhausted comic dignity, and the whole political situation of the age is in it, a great power reduced to an unpaid invoice and a very long wait on a foreign quay. So ends the New Kingdom, around 1070 years before the Common Era. Egypt has now been a state more or less continuously for 2,000 years. It will be a state for another 1,000. But it will never again be the strongest power in its own neighborhood, and from here on the story is about a very old, very rich, very stubborn civilization being repeatedly governed by other people and absorbing them. The next 400 years are called the Third Intermediate Period, and they are complicated in the way a family estate is complicated when nobody wrote a will. The kings of the 21st dynasty ruled the north from Taunus in the eastern delta, and they built there in the most economical way imaginable, by shipping in the stonework of older cities and reusing it, so that Taunus is a jumble of obelisks and colossi with 3 different kings' names on them, and was mistaken for a much older capital for 2 centuries because of it. Their royal tombs, found in the 1930s, are the only other essentially intact royal burials ever discovered in Egypt, and they contained silver coffins made in the shape of a falcon and a hawk-headed man, and gold masks, and they were found by a French archaeologist in 1939 and announced to a world that was about to have other things on its mind, which is why almost nobody has heard of them. Meanwhile, the high priests of Amun ruled the south from Thebes, and the 2 houses intermarried and generally got along, and the country worked as a partnership. Then came a line of kings descended from the Libyan settlers of the Delta, the 22nd dynasty, ruling from Bubastis, whose most successful member campaigned in Canaan and is very probably the king named in the Hebrew Bible as having taken the treasures of the temple at Jerusalem. They held it together for a century and then fragmented into a bewildering patchwork of local dynasties, so that at one point in the 8th century there were 4 or 5 men in Egypt simultaneously using the full royal titles, each with a few towns, all of them writing as though they ruled the 2 lands. And then, from the south, from the direction nobody was watching, came a reunification. In Nubia, at the foot of a flat-topped sandstone mountain called Jebel Barkal, which the Egyptians had believed 1,000 years earlier to be the southern home of Amun, a kingdom had grown up at Napata that was thoroughly and devoutly Egyptian in religion. These were the Cushites, and they had absorbed the Egyptian gods and the Egyptian script and the Egyptian afterlife during the centuries of New Kingdom rule, and had then been left alone for 300 years to develop it in their own way, and they now regarded the chaos in the north as a scandal. Around 747 before the Common Era, their King Pi came north with an army, took city after city, and imposed himself as Pharaoh. His victory inscription is unlike any other Egyptian war text because he is genuinely more concerned about religious propriety than about conquest. He pauses the campaign to celebrate a festival. He inspects the temples. He is furious with a defeated prince, not for resisting, but for eating fish, which was forbidden to the pure, and he refuses to admit certain local rulers into his presence because they were uncircumcised and had eaten fish and were therefore, he explains, unclean. He also stops in the middle of the account to be upset about the state of the horses he found in one besieged city, which had been on short rations during the siege, and this passage is the only moment in Egyptian royal literature where a king weeps, and he weeps about horses. The Kushite 25th dynasty ruled all of Egypt and Nubia for about 60 years, and it was a period of genuine renaissance. They restored the temples with real money, revived Old Kingdom art styles deliberately and studied ancient texts, promoted classical language, and their sculpture is instantly recognizable and superb, broad, powerful, unidealized faces with heavy features and a look of thoughtful severity, wearing the double uraeus and a tight cap crown, and they are among the finest portraits of the ancient world. They also revived the pyramid 500 years after Egypt had abandoned it for their own burials at El Kuru and Nuri and later Meroe, building them small and steep-sided, and there are more pyramids standing in Sudan today than in Egypt, by a factor of 2, which is a fact that consistently astonishes people. What ended them was Assyria. The Assyrian Empire in Mesopotamia was the most efficient military machine the world had yet produced, and Egypt's support for rebel cities in Canaan brought it down the coast. The Kushite king Taharka fought them for years and lost ground steadily, and in 667 the Assyrians came all the way down the valley and sacked Thebes itself, which had not been touched by a foreign army in its entire history, and carried off 2 obelisks and, according to their own boasting inscriptions, an enormous quantity of everything else. The shock of that ran through the ancient world. There is a Hebrew prophecy that uses the fall of Thebes as the standard example of an unthinkable catastrophe. The Kushites withdrew south to their own kingdom, which carried on prosperously and independently for another 1,000 years, keeping Egyptian gods and Egyptian pyramids long after Egypt itself had stopped. The Assyrians, being practical, installed local governors in the delta to run Egypt for them, and one of those families from the city of Sais promptly used the Assyrian withdrawal to make itself independent. This is the 26th dynasty, the Site period, and it is the last time Egypt was ruled by Egyptians for any real length of time, and it is a remarkable century and a half. They reunified the country, hired Greek and Carian mercenaries in large numbers, and settled them in their own towns, opened a trading port in the Delta where Greek merchants were allowed to live and worship in their own way, built a navy, and, according to Herodotus, dispatched a Phoenician expedition which sailed all the way around Africa from the Red Sea and returned 3 years later through the Straits at Gibraltar, and which reported that at one point the sun had been on their right-hand side, that is, to the north, a detail so odd that Herodotus says he does not believe it, and which is the single best proof that the voyage actually happened. One of their kings also began digging a canal from the Nile to the Red Sea, and gave up. Reportedly, after an oracle told him he was doing the Persians a favor, which turned out to be entirely correct. Culturally, the Site Age is one long, deliberate act of remembering. Sculptors copied Old Kingdom statues so exactly that museum curators have occasionally been fooled by 2,000 years. Scribes hunted out archaic titles and revived them. Ancient religious texts were recopied and recarved. Animal cults expanded enormously, with vast catacombs of mummified cats and ibises and bulls and crocodiles buried by the million as offerings by ordinary pilgrims. Egypt in this period is aware of itself as ancient. It has begun to curate its own past, which is a thing societies do when they can feel the weather changing. The weather arrived in 525 before the Common Era in the shape of the Persian Empire, which by then ruled everything from the Aegean to the Indus and which had been intending to add Egypt for some time. The Persian king Cambyses defeated the Egyptian army at Pelusium on the eastern edge of the Delta, and took the country, and Egypt became a province, the wealthiest in the empire, governed by a satrap for about 120 years. Greek writers who loathed the Persians left us lurid stories about Cambyses behaving outrageously, killing a sacred bull and mocking the temples, and the Egyptian evidence flatly contradicts them. The burial of the sacred bull that took place in his reign was carried out with full honors and paid for by the king whose name is on the sarcophagus, and he took Egyptian royal titles and behaved, on the whole, like a pharaoh who happened to live somewhere else. His successor Darius built a temple in the western desert oasis and finished that canal to the Red Sea. Persian rule was resented anyway, mainly because the tax went abroad and there were repeated revolts, and for about 60 years in the 4th century, Egypt actually won its independence back under 3 native dynasties, the last of which was the 28th, 29th, and 30th by Manetho's count, based in the delta at Mendes and then Sebennytos. The last of these, Nectanebo II, was the last native-born Egyptian to rule Egypt as Pharaoh. He was a great builder, and if you have ever seen an Egyptian temple in the standard late style, with its screen walls and its composite floral capitals, you have very likely seen his work or work in his idiom. In 343, the Persians came back, and this second occupation was harsher and briefer, and it lasted 11 years. And then, in 332, before the Common Era, a 24-year-old Macedonian arrived. Alexander took Egypt without a battle. The Persian satrap surrendered the country and the population by every account we have, welcomed the Macedonians as liberators, which they were for about a fortnight. Alexander did 3 things that mattered. He went to Memphis and sacrificed to the Egyptian gods and was crowned as Pharaoh with the full traditional ceremony, which instantly gave him a legitimacy no Persian had bothered to acquire. He made an extremely arduous journey out into the western desert to the oasis of Siwa, to the oracle of Amun, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus, and went into the shrine alone, and came out and never publicly said what the priest had told him, though he behaved thereafter like a man who had been informed that he was the son of a god. And, on the way, he stopped at a fishing village on a limestone spit between the sea and a freshwater lake at the western edge of the delta, and looked at the shape of the harbor and decided to found a city there. He then left Egypt, never returned alive, and died 8 years later in Babylon at 32, and his enormous empire was divided among his generals, and the general who took Egypt was a shrewd, tough, literate Macedonian named Ptolemy, who had been with him since boyhood, and who did something no other successor thought of. He intercepted Alexander's funeral cortege on its way home to Macedonia and diverted the body to Egypt and installed it in a tomb in Alexandria because he understood exactly how much a relic is worth. So begins the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. Every king called Ptolemy, and a large number of the queens called Cleopatra, or Berenice, or Arsinoe, and which is the last dynasty of ancient Egypt. It was a Greek monarchy sitting on top of an Egyptian country. The court spoke Greek, the army and administration were staffed largely by Greek and Macedonian settlers, and the whole system was designed to extract the wealth of the valley with a thoroughness that made the pharaohs look casual. State monopolies on oil and textiles and papyrus and beer, a land survey updated annually, tax farming, and a coinage which Egypt had never really had before. And yet, on the temple walls, these kings appear in kilt and double crown, offering to Horus and Hathor exactly as Ramesses had, with their Greek names written in hieroglyphs inside cartouches, spelled out laboriously, letter by letter. The Ptolemies rebuilt the temples on an enormous scale, and this is the crucial thing that visitors to Egypt almost never realize. The best preserved and most complete Egyptian temples in the world. The ones you walk into and photograph and stand in the middle of feeling the weight of antiquity, the temples at Edfu and Dendera and Calm Ombo and Philae are not from the age of the pyramids at all. They were built by Greek kings within a few centuries of the Roman Empire, by a dynasty descended from one of Alexander's officers in a style already 2,500 years old, and they are astonishing precisely because they are late. Edfu still has its roof, its enclosure wall, its great doorway, and a carved account of a sacred drama performed there annually. Dendera has a stone spiral staircase you can climb to the roof and a ceiling of astronomical figures so dense you cannot take it in at once. Philae, on its island at the first cataract, was so beautiful that it became the last functioning temple of the old religion in the world, and in the 1970s it too was cut apart and moved to a higher island to save it from the reservoir. And Alexandria became the most important city in the Mediterranean. It was laid out on a grid, with a great harbor divided by a causeway to an island called Pharaoh, and on Pharaoh they built a lighthouse, in 3 tapering stages more than 300 feet high, with a mirror at the top and a fire, and ships could see it from 30 miles out at sea. And it was one of the 7 wonders, and it stood for 1,600 years until earthquakes brought it down, and its blocks are on the seabed and in the walls of a 15th century fort built on the same spot. And beside the palace they built the museum, meaning the Shrine of the Muses, which was an institution the world had not seen before. A residential research establishment, state-funded, where scholars were given a salary, meals, lodging, freedom from taxes, and nothing to do except think. And attached to it was the library. The Library of Alexandria was an attempt to own every book in the world, and it was pursued with a mixture of scholarship and outright piracy. Agents were sent to buy manuscripts at the book fairs of the Aegean. Every ship that docked at Alexandria was searched for scrolls, which were confiscated, copied, and returned in the form of the copy, while the original was kept. And the practice was so routine that the catalog had a category for it. They borrowed the official state manuscripts of the Athenian tragedians against an enormous cash deposit, made copies, kept the originals, and cheerfully forfeited the deposit. At its height, the collection is said to have run to several 100,000 scrolls. And the scholars who worked among them did things that changed everything afterwards. One of them measured the circumference of the earth by comparing the length of a shadow at noon in 2 cities a known distance apart, and got a figure within a few % of the true one, using a stick, a well, and some arithmetic. Another produced the first systematic edition of the poems of Homer, invented the standard marks for dubious lines, and gave us the very idea of textual criticism. Another proposed, 1,700 years before it was accepted, that the earth goes around the sun. Another wrote the 13 books of geometry that were still being used as a school textbook in the 1930s. The physicians of Alexandria, working with a freedom no Greek city would have allowed, established that the nerves run to the brain, and that the brain is the organ of thought, distinguished sensory from motor nerves, and named a great deal of the anatomy we still name, and the library did not burn down in one dramatic night. What whatever the story says. It declined the way institutions decline. A king expelled the scholars in a political purge, and they scattered to other cities, taking the prestige with them. Part of the collection was damaged when Julius Caesar's troops set fire to ships in the harbor, and the fire spread to warehouses on the dock. Funding thinned. A later emperor cut the stipends. A daughter library in a temple precinct was destroyed in a much later religious riot, and by the time the Arab armies arrived in the 7th century, the story that they burned it is almost certainly a legend attached to a building that had not existed for a very long time. The loss of the library is real and enormous, but it is not a crime scene. It is an attrition. It is what happens when nobody renews the budget for 300 years. The Ptolemies themselves make for lively reading and are not, on the whole, an advertisement for hereditary monarchy. There were brother-sister marriages, several murders inside the family, at least 2 civil wars between rival Ptolemies, one king who was so unpopular that the Alexandrians rioted him out of the city, another so enormous that his nickname was a word for a large stomach, and a general pattern in the later reigns of appealing to Rome to settle the family's arguments, which is roughly as safe as inviting a bank to arbitrate a dispute over your house. Roman influence grew steadily. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Egypt was formally independent and practically a Roman client, and its kings ruled with Roman loans and Roman goodwill. And that is the world into which the last of them was born, in about 69 before the Common Era, the daughter of Ptolemy XII, and her name was Cleopatra, and she was the 7th of her name. Almost everything popularly believed about her is either wrong or beside the point. She was not Egyptian by ancestry, but Macedonian Greek, the descendant of Ptolemy's officer, and she was the first of her entire line, after 300 years in the country, to bother learning the Egyptian language. Ancient writers who were not friendly to her, and almost none of them were, agree that she was formidably educated and spoke somewhere between 7 and 9 languages, and that she conducted her own negotiations without interpreters, and that her power was in her intelligence and her voice. Plutarch, writing a century later, says almost in passing that her beauty was not in itself incomparable, and that the charm lay in her presence and her conversation, and it is a mark of how thoroughly her reputation was rewritten that this is now the surprising version. She came to the throne at 18, jointly with a younger brother, was pushed out by his advisors, and came back. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival in the Roman Civil War, she had herself brought into his presence past her brother's guards, wrapped, according to one account, in a rolled-up carpet or a sack of bedding, which is the sort of detail that survives because it is too good to lose. She and Caesar became allies and lovers. Her brother's faction was defeated. She was restored. And she had a son whom she named Caesarion. She went to Rome, which found her fascinating and appalling. And then Caesar was killed, and Rome fell into civil war again, and Cleopatra had to pick a side, and she picked Mark Antony, who controlled the East, and who spent the next decade in Alexandria being far happier than his political career could withstand. They had 3 children, including twins. They were denounced in Rome by Caesar's heir Octavian in a propaganda campaign of remarkable skill, which recast a Roman general's alliance with a foreign queen as the seduction of a Roman soldier by an Eastern sorceress, and which has been believed essentially unamended for 2,000 years. In 31, before the Common Era, their combined fleet met Octavian's off the western coast of Greece at Actium and lost, partly because their ships were undermanned by illness and partly because a large part of the fleet was blockaded and demoralized, and Antony and Cleopatra broke out with a squadron and sailed home. The following summer Octavian came to Egypt. Antony's remaining forces went over to him, and in the palace at Alexandria, one after the other, Antony and then Cleopatra chose to end their lives rather than be taken to Rome and led through the streets in a triumph, which was the fate Octavian had planned for her and which she understood perfectly. The famous asp may or may not have been involved. The ancient accounts are already uncertain about it a century later, and a physician who was there apparently reported only 2 small marks on her arm. She was 39 years old. Her son Caesarion was hunted down, and with her Egypt as an independent kingdom, which had begun with a catfish and a chisel carved above the head of a king in a green stone pallet 3,000 years before, came to an end. Egypt did not stop existing in 30 before the Common Era. It became a Roman province, and a peculiar one, held as the personal property of the emperor rather than governed by the Senate, because whoever controlled Egypt controlled the grain that fed the city of Rome, and no emperor was willing to let a rival senator anywhere near it. Enormous fleets of grain ships sailed from Alexandria every summer. The emperors appear on the temple walls in the kilt and a double crown, offering to the gods their Roman names spelled out in hieroglyphs, and there is something almost comic about seeing a man who never left Italy carved as a pharaoh smiting foreigners at Esna. Temples went on being built and decorated for another 200 years. Mummification continued, but the coffin lid changed. In the Fayum, families began commissioning portraits of the dead painted in colored wax on wooden panels in the full Greco-Roman style and setting them into the wrappings over the face. And those portraits are the most disconcerting objects in any Egyptian museum, because they are not stylized at all. They are individuals. A young man with a shadow of stubble and a slightly crooked nose, a woman in gold earrings with tired, amused eyes, a boy with a wisp of a mustache and a wreath in his hair. They look at you across 2,000 years with the directness of a passport photograph, and they were made by people who still believed in the field of reeds. Then, over the 3rd and 4th centuries, the old religion faded. It was not one blow. The temple economies were taxed and then confiscated. The priesthoods lost their endowments and their literacy. Christianity spread rapidly and deeply in Egypt, which produced some of the earliest monasteries in the world out in the same western desert where the dead had always gone. And eventually, the emperors legislated against the old rites outright. The temples were shut or converted, and the shrines were built into churches. And on the 11th of August in the year 394 of the Common Era, in a small doorway on the island of Philae, a priest named Nesmeterekem carved a short inscription recording an offering and dated it and signed it. It is the last hieroglyphic inscription ever made. Nobody told him he was the last. He was simply doing what his family had done for 100 generations, and then the temple closed, and the students stopped coming, and within a lifetime or two there was nobody left on earth who could read the words of the god. The script became silent. The knowledge did not survive in books, because the books that explained it were in the script. For 1,400 years the temple stood in the sand, covered with the most complete writing system of the ancient world, and everybody who looked at them could see that it meant something, and nobody could say what. Learned men decided the signs must be pure symbols mystical emblems of ideas, and built long, elaborate, wrong interpretations. And the wrongness of that guess is the single reason it took so long. Because as long as you believe the pictures are symbols, you will never sound them out. The language itself did not die, though. It went on being spoken, written in a modified Greek alphabet as Coptic, the language of the Egyptian church, and it is still chanted in Coptic liturgy today. So that the vowels of ancient Egyptians survive, faintly in the singing of hymns, having outlived the empire that spoke them. What broke the silence was a slab of gray granite found in 1799 by French soldiers strengthening a fort in the delta near a town called Rashid, which the French called Rosette. It carried one decree in 3 scripts, hieroglyphs at the top, damaged, the cursive Egyptian of daily use in the middle, and Greek at the bottom, complete and readable. The Greek said explicitly that the 3 texts were versions of the same thing. It took 23 years even so. An English polymath established that some of the signs were phonetic and correctly read one royal name. And then a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion, who had taught himself Coptic as a boy, specifically because he suspected it was the descendant of the ancient language, and who could therefore recognize ancient Egyptian words when he finally spelled them out, worked through royal names in cartouches on the stone and on copies of a temple inscription until, in September of 1822, he saw the pattern hold across a whole word that was not a name. He ran to his brother's office, said that he had got it, and collapsed and was in bed for several days. He was 31. He lived only another 9 years, long enough to visit Egypt once and read the walls in front of him, which is, when you think about it, the most enviable moment any scholar has ever had, standing in a temple, at night, with a lamp, reading, so what is left of it all. Look around you, and it is difficult to say what is not. The 365-day year with 12 months, which came to us through Rome from Egypt. The 24-hour day divided by Egyptian priests watching the rising of stars. The idea of writing on a portable, flexible sheet, and the word paper. The oldest surgical text in existence, sober and secular, describing head injuries with observations and prognosis and no magic. The oldest strike, the oldest peace treaty, the oldest name of an architect. Stone architecture with columns, which Greece learned partly here. The mathematics of building. The plow, the loom, the lock, the door hinge, the folding stool, the calendar, the census. And an image bank so powerful that 3,000 years after the last hieroglyph was carved, no child anywhere needs to be told what a pyramid or a sphinx or a golden mask is. But the thing I would leave you with is smaller than any of that. It is a papyrus in a museum drawer, written by a man complaining about his household's grain. It is a red-painted gang name daubed on the back of a block where no one was meant to see it. It is a diary of boat trips kept by an inspector named Mirror. It is a note written on a bandage by a priest saying which king this is and when he was made comfortable again. It is a scarab with a small pleading message to a person's own heart, laid over that heart so it could be read all the way down. Empires are the loud part of history, and they are, in the end, the least of it. What the Nile actually preserved for us was the sound of ordinary people being careful with one another, labeling, mending, rewrapping, keeping the accounts, going back for the missing pieces. The river is still there, though it does not flood anymore, because we put a dam across it in the 1960s, and now the black mud stays behind the wall. The desert on either side is still there, holding everything it was given. History does not disappear. It simply becomes the ground under our feet, and it goes on quietly holding us up. And now let it all sink away, the crowns and the canals and the copper chisels. Down into the dark like the sun going into the west, where it will be perfectly safe until morning. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another long, quiet story waiting for you on the screen, and it will begin the moment this one ends, so there is no need to reach for anything. If this helped you rest, you might gently like the video or subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And do leave your location and your local time in the comments so the next sleepless person knows they are not alone at this hour. Let your breathing go slow and even. Let your hands go heavy. The flood has come in, and the fields are covered, and there is nothing at all to be done until the water goes down. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.